A 3-foot convicted criminal has sparked outrage after he amassed more than 62,000 followers on social media in the past 48 hours, while still behind bars. Aidan Henry, who is in jail for burglary, became an online sensation after he uploaded videos on a banned mobile phone while behind bars. It is not the first time the 28-year-old from London, dubbed Britain's smallest prisoner, has managed to obtain a phone, as he previously released footage threatening to rape a boxing world champion and of himself belly-flopping into a bath. Henry opened new social media accounts 2 days ago, which show him diving into a bin bag filled with ice, boasting about guns, grinding suggestively and posting topless selfies from behind bars. The convict racked up 52,000 followers on Instagram in just 2 days under the handle @LittleManInSauce, with famous fans like rapper Lethal Bizzle liking his social media activity. However, his page was reported and deleted last night. Henry is still defying prison rules and uploading content on Snapchat as @LittleMan, where he claimed to have 10,000 followers on the platform yesterday. He was sentenced to 32 months for burglary of a property in Rugby, Warwickshire. It was reported he could face additional time in prison for posting illegal footage on YouTube threatening Britain's world champion boxer Billy Joe Saunders. It does not appear to have deterred the criminal, who has been posting on Snapchat and promised to return to Instagram after *King Pigs reported his profile. The clip of him diving into an ice bin bag just 2 days ago racked up an impressive 123,000 views in a day, while another clip of him with the caption "Someone line up a big baddie gal for a me" and dancing suggestively to a dancehall song amassed 164,000 views on Instagram. In another video posted on Snapchat, Henry was seen inside his locked prison cell while inmates show off a diamond-encrusted watch. In other footage, Henry and another inmate boasted about having a trigger strap 24/7 *******. The 3-foot convict then imitates pulling the trigger of a gun at the camera and shouts, "Boom!" On his Snapchat account yesterday, Henry posted a photo in which he gives the middle finger inside jail. In the snap, he posed topless whilst wearing Nike sliders. He also uploaded a second topless photo of himself in which he is seen posing with a cheeky grin beside a prison fence. Henry's social media followers praised the inmates' hilarious antics, and some have even demanded that he get a television show and be given early release. Adam Selfie said, "These guys having more fun in jail than I'm having on road," and that Drift Rentals said, "Looks like jail is a motive cause of this guy." Whilst @Nalepo Ranger demanded "TV show when you touch road," and that HUZ-K.7 exclaimed, "Free this little man." Other users commented on the fact that Henry had a better social media presence than most. More than 1,200 sex offenders have succeeded in getting themselves removed from the register, despite the fact they were placed on it indefinitely. A shocking 632 criminals who had their names taken off the list within the past 6 years had committed their crimes against a child under the age of 16. They were allowed to do so under a change in the law in 2012 that granted criminals who had an indefinite notification to remain on the register to appeal after 15 years. The staggering numbers were uncovered by an investigation by Good Morning Britain that was revealed on Wednesday. No longer being on the register means offenders don't have to tell officials about their movements when they move house or spend more than a week away from home. Some examples of those who had their names removed from the register include an attacker who raped a boy under the age of 13 and an offender who raped a girl under the age of 16. Several forces would not comment if those who had their names removed from the list had gone on to reoffend. Scotland admitted 3 went on to reoffend, One was a rapist who had extreme pornography and another had taken indecent photographs of children, according to GMB. A breakdown of appeals and the rate they were granted includes: Denise Fergus, the mother of James Bulger, is outraged over the findings and told GMB, "I am disgusted that people are able to start a process to be removed from the sex offenders register. The figures are very daunting when you look at each county and see the amount of applications that have been made and how many are actually successful in being removed from the register. Many of these are for offenses against children, and that child and their family will be victims for life, so why should the offender have the ability to be removed? Surely if you are put on the sex offender register for life, your offenses are so." Yesterday, Donald Trump lobbed a hand grenade into American domestic politics, and the resulting explosion will have far-reaching consequences. At that news conference in Helsinki, following a 2-hour summit with Russian Premier Vladimir Putin behind closed doors, the U.S. president declared that he did not believe his own intelligence sources when they told him that Moscow interfered in the 2016 American elections. President Putin says it's not Russia. "I don't see any reason why it should be," Mr. Trump said. Even by the standards of a man who regularly causes diplomatic earthquakes with a single tweet, this was an extraordinary stance, publicly disagreeing with his own heads of intelligence. Rather than listen to the CIA and the FBI, he is dismissing their claims and accepting the word of the man who leads America's most powerful global rival. In the States, Trump critics have reacted with apoplexy. The Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives Paul Ryan, a fellow Republican, issued a stern warning that the president must appreciate that Russia is not our ally. And John Brennan, the former head of the CIA under President Obama, went further, calling for the president to be impeached, the process by which a sitting president can be removed from power, on the grounds that his statement had been nothing short of treasonous. Not only were Trump's comments imbecilic, he is wholly in the pocket of Putin, he tweeted. The impact of Mr. Trump's statement is all the greater because of the high-handed and provocative way he has treated his allies in recent days. He has sneered at NATO, belittled some of its leaders, and spoken of the European Union as an adversary. In Britain, he gave an interview criticizing Prime Minister Theresa May, which he subsequently dismissed as fake news. His emollient manner towards Russia could not have been in sharper contrast. He was, quite simply, all sweetness and light, smiles, simpers and even a wink, towards Vladimir Putin, who at times seemed barely able to conceal his amusement. Trump's motive appears to be injured pride. He feels that his intelligence chiefs are disputing the legitimacy of his surprise election victory in November 2016. In fact, there appears to be no evidence of actual vote tampering or rigged counts. What Mr. Trump's critics say, including his sacked FBI chief James Comey, is that Russia attempted to manipulate public opinion, for example by setting up hundreds of bogus Twitter and Facebook accounts to spread misinformation. When an American journalist challenged Mr. Putin yesterday to admit that he had wanted to see Mr. Trump in the White House and had ordered a campaign of interference to achieve this, the Russian leader pointedly answered only the first part of the question. Of course, he said, he wanted former front-runner Hillary Clinton to lose the election. We have no reason to doubt that, as Secretary of State under Obama, Mrs. Clinton had taken a tough line against Moscow. It is striking that Mr. Putin did not take the opportunity to directly deny charges of interference. But there are persistent whispers that Mr. Trump's pleas for rapprochement with Russia, at a time when most democratic countries, including Britain, are sharply critical of Moscow in the aftermath of the annexation of Crimea and the Novikov attack in Salisbury, are fueled by something more sinister. Reports that the Russians have explosive material that could be used to blackmail the president have been around for years. MI6 agent Christopher Steele reputedly compiled a dossier, seen by Barack Obama, and allegedly implicating Mr. Trump in debased sexual acts with prostitutes at a Moscow hotel in 2013, when he was present for the Miss Universe contest. All these lurid claims and accusations are bound to resurface, along with wider calls for impeachment. This comes in the run-up to the U.S. midterm elections in November, and may well have the effect of paralyzing the entire political establishment as Democrats battle to secure Mr. Trump's removal and the president seeks to defend himself, leaving the Republicans in general disarray. Whether by accident or design, Donald Trump's statements have created a domestic crisis in the U.S. He may not be Mr. Putin's agent, but the Russians will nonetheless be grateful to him. Around £11 million worth of luxury BMWs are to be scrapped after they were accidentally covered in sand while being shipped to Britain. A huge pile of sand blew over the cars in strong winds at the German port of Cuxhaven, writing off around 450 vehicles. Around 3,500 other cars needed to be cleaned and checked before they could be sent to British BMW dealerships. According to workers, several of the company's flagship vehicles, reportedly including the £120,000 i8 hybrid sports car, were affected when the sand, which was also waiting at the port, blew over. A firm in Southampton was tasked with cleaning up to 30 single-quote cars a day between April and June, and had to remove sand from air filters and alternators, an employee claimed. Images from the operation show sand coming out of a car's bumper and pooling underneath. An insider said, "A flat matte paint job for these cars costs around £20,000. They are that expensive." Around 4,000 cars were covered by big mountains of sand. Many were scrapped, costing BMW a small fortune. The vehicles they didn't scrap were distributed around the UK. "We service BMWs to make them squeaky clean for dealerships and rental companies in the south of England. A lot of cars which came through to us had some falling out, including one car which had some falling from the bumper." With a typical BMW 3 Series, the firm's most popular vehicle, costing £25,000, the 450 wrecked models are believed to have cost over £11 million. BMW denied i8s were among those scrapped, but said 450 cars were destroyed and had to be replaced. A BMW spokesman said, "A number of BMW vehicle orders were affected due to a major storm in Cuxhaven, one of the key ports through which many UK-bound vehicles travel. The severe weather resulted in construction materials located at the port contaminating a number of vehicles while in transit. Roughly 4,000 cars were at the port, so needed to be checked. Of those, there are about 450 where we deemed it necessary to either build a new car for the customer or offer them an alternative vehicle that we already had in stock." The spokesman added, "As a precaution, we thoroughly checked and cleaned every vehicle, many of which were completely unaffected. However, some were affected by varying degrees of sand ingress as a result of the sandstorm. In the case of these more severely affected cases, these customer orders." Boris Johnson gave a scathing verdict on Theresa May's Brexit plans tonight as his resignation letter said the Brexit dream is dying, suffocated by needless self-doubt. The ex-Foreign Secretary said Mrs. May was putting Britain on a track to having the status of a colony. Mr. Johnson said Britain was destined for a semi-Brexit if the blueprint agreed by the cabinet at Chequers on Friday is delivered. He said selling the policy would stick in the throat, and he could not stand by waving white flags of surrender, meaning he had to quit. The damning criticism in his resignation letter was Mr. Johnson's first explanation for his stunning decision to walk out of government this afternoon. He was under fire today as even David Davis said he did not need to quit as Foreign Secretary, prompting claims he resigned to further his own ambition. Mr. Davis quit late last night in a stunning first blow to the PM. ITV's Robert Peston claimed today he was offered Mr. Johnson's job to persuade him to stay. Mr. Johnson then rocked the government to its foundations by becoming the second cabinet minister to resign in less than 24 hours. The resignations are a stunning reversal from Friday's special cabinet at Chequers, when all ministers signed up and Mr. Johnson proposed a toast to the deal, even suggested a joint newspaper column with Chancellor Philip Hammond. Instead, Mrs. May was tonight scrambling to shore up her ailing premiership amid fierce rumors she is set to face a no-confidence vote, possibly within hours. After 2 hours in the Commons defending her plans, the PM faced Tory MPs behind closed doors, with many warning her offer gave too much away. In an apparent boost for the embattled PM, chairman of the powerful 1922 committee, Sir Graham Brady, is said to have confirmed at the meeting currently he has not received the 48 letters from MPs that would trigger a no-confidence vote. In his resignation letter, Mr. Johnson said, "Brexit should be about opportunity and hope. It should be a chance to do things differently, to be more nimble and dynamic, and to maximize the particular advantages of the UK as an open, outward-looking global economy. That dream is dying, suffocated by needless self-doubt." Mr. Johnson said crucial decisions on preparing for a no-deal Brexit had been postponed, meaning Britain was headed for a semi-Brexit. He said, "We are now in the ludicrous position of asserting we must accept huge amounts of precisely such EU law, without changing an iota, because it is essential for our economic health, and when we no longer have any ability to influence these laws as they are made. In that respect we are truly headed for the status of colony, and many will struggle to the economic or political advantages of that particular arrangement." Mr. Johnson said he accepted his side of the argument lacked support to win out at Cabinet on Friday. He told the Prime Minister, "As I said then, the government now has a song to sing. The trouble is that I have practiced the words over the weekend and find that they stick in the throat. There is speculation that either Trade Secretary Liam Fox or Environment Secretary Michael Gove could be shifted to take Mr. Johnson's role." Earlier, Mrs. May shrugged off jeers as she made a statement to the Commons just minutes after Mr. Johnson resigned. The Prime Minister mounted an impassioned defense of her plan for future trade with the EU, saying it represented Brexit in our national interest. Theresa May faces a mortal threat to her leadership of the Conservative Party and government today. A Tory leadership contest can be called in one of two ways: if Mrs. May resigns, or if MPs force and win a vote of no confidence in her. Calling votes of no confidence is the responsibility of the chairman of the 1922 committee, which includes all backbench Tory MPs. Chairman Graham Brady is obliged to call a vote if 15% of Tory MPs write to him calling for one, currently 48 MPs. The process is secret, and only Mr. Brady knows how many letters he has received. The procedure was last used in 2003 when Ian Duncan Smith was ousted as Tory leader. If Mrs. May is ousted, any MP is eligible to stand. Conservative MPs will then hold a series of ballots to whittle the list of contenders down to two, with the last place candidate dropping out in each round. The final two candidates are then offered to the Tory membership at large for an election. No 10 has also insisted Mrs May is ready to fight for her job if furious Eurosceptics force a no-confidence vote in her leadership. Mrs May arrived smiling, accompanied by her Chief of Staff Gavin Barwell. She joked with reporters outside the event, "I wonder what you are doing here." The Premier was greeted with table banging and some cheers of "hear hear" and applause as she arrived. The meeting of the parliamentary party was absolutely packed, with many MPs struggling to get in. Applause and feet stamping could be heard several times during the meeting. Mrs May tried to put a brave face on the shattering blow this afternoon, paying tribute to Mr Johnson's commitment to global Britain. But some Labour MPs jeered, "Bye," and "resign," as she stood up to address the chamber. The Premier's grip on Downing Street is hanging by a thread after Mr Johnson delivered his bombshell news after hours of speculation about his intentions. An O10 spokesman said, "This afternoon, the Prime Minister accepted the resignation of Boris Johnson as Foreign Secretary. His replacement will be announced shortly. The Prime Minister thanks Boris for his work." Senior Tory Brexiteers Jacob Rees-Mogg said the departure was more proof that Chequers is not Brexit. Former Cabinet Minister John Whittingdale hailed the enormous act of bravery. Asked about his reaction to Mr Johnson's resignation by Ian Dale on LBC, Mr Davis replied, "Regret, really. I had resigned because this was central." Theresa May's premiership is hanging in the balance after David Davis and Boris Johnson quit in a shock double cabinet resignation. Here are the odds, via bookmakers Ladbrokes, on who will be the next PM. Michael Gove, Environment Secretary, -9.5 has buried the hatchet with Mr Johnson after brutally ending his Tory leadership campaign in the wake of David Cameron's resignation. Thought to be less concerned with short-term concessions at Mr Johnson, but focused on ensuring the UK is free from Brussels rules in the longer term. Jeremy Corbyn, Labour leader, -5/1. The Labour leader will be hoping to capitalise on Brexit disarray in the cabinet to seize power himself in an election. Sajid Javid, Home Secretary, -5/1, brought in to replace Amber Rudd after she resigned amid the Windrush scandal. Mr Javid was seen as a reluctant Remainer in the referendum. Many thought the former high-flying banker would plump for the Leave campaign, but he eventually claimed to have been won over by the economic case. He is likely to be guided by evidence about trade calculations and discussions over how closely aligned the UK should be with the EU. Jacob Rees-Mogg, Tory backbencher, -6/1. A leading Tory backbencher, he is chairman of the European Research Group, the powerful group of backbench Brexit-backing Tory MPs. Boris Johnson, ex-Foreign Secretary, -8/1. The Brexit champion in the cabinet until today, has been agitating for a more robust approach and previously played down the problems of leaving with no deal. He is unhappy with plans for a tight customs arrangement with Brussels, warning that it could effectively mean being lashed to the EU indefinitely. Said to have bluntly dismissed concerns from pro-EU companies by saying "F*** business." Andrea Leeson, Commons leader, -12/1. A leading Brexiteer who ran for the leadership last year before pulling out, allowing Theresa May to be crowned. Jeremy Hunt, Health Secretary, -14/1. A Remainer in the referendum campaign, Mr Hunt has since embraced the Brexiteer arguments, with speculation that he is positioning for a tilt at the top job should Mrs May be abruptly ousted. He has been heavily Dominic Raab, Brexit Secretary, -16/1. The new Brexit Secretary, Mr Raab, is a leading Brexiteer who has been brought into the cabinet after David Davis' shock resignation. David Davis, ex-Brexit secretary, -25 over 1, a longtime Eurosceptic and veteran of the 1990s Maastricht battles, brought back by Mrs. May in 2016 to oversee the day-to-day negotiations. He has plunged her government into chaos after sensationally quitting last night. He has said the government will be seeking a Canada plus deal from the EU. This was central to my job, and if we continue with this policy and I was still there, I'd have to present it in the House of Commons. I'd have to present it in Europe. I'd have to be the champion of the policy which I didn't believe in, so that doesn't work. Somebody else can do a better job than me under those circumstances. I don't think it's central to the Foreign Secretary. It's a pity, but there we are. Mr. Davis denied coordinating his resignation with Mr. Johnson. No. I told a number of ministers last night just after actually, now I think about it, I decided what to do, but that was just to keep them informed. Scottish Tory chief Miss Davidson said she fully supported Mrs. May's Chequers deal. She said, "The Prime Minister made clear this weekend that collective cabinet responsibility must be observed on Brexit. If individual ministers can't sign up to that, then it is only right they are no longer part of the government." Miss Davidson said the Chequers plan was a pragmatic response that honored the referendum. She added, "I believe therefore that the Prime Minister deserves our support as she prepares for the upcoming tough negotiations with the European Union. I would urge colleagues to put their shoulders to the wheel in supporting the Prime Minister in that job." Labour MP Ian Murari said, "Boris needn't have spent too much time on a resignation letter. He should have just said, I've seen the opportunity to be PM, so I'm, for the second time, going to take that opportunity. Hang the country." SNP Westminster leader Ian Blackford said, "Boris Johnson should have been sacked for being a national embarrassment months ago, not allowed to resign. His resignation shows the absolutely chaotic circus this government has become and shows the Prime Minister with no authority. The government is now paralyzed in its own Brexit chaos." The PM's position has been looking increasingly perilous as MPs vent their rage about the blueprint signed off by ministers at Chequers. After a weekend apparently seething about the outcome, Mr. Davis resigned late last night and delivered an excoriating verdict on the plans. He complained that Mrs. May had undermined him by ignoring his views on a significant number of occasions and put the UK on track to be humbled by Brussels. Mrs. May tried to shore up her cabinet this morning by drafting in Dominic Raab to replace Mr. Davis. But the Tory wrath has been inflamed further after it emerged that Mrs. May's Chief of Staff Gavin Barwell is briefing opposition MPs in a bid to win them over to her third-way proposals for future trade with the EU. Brexiteers warned that the Premier will not survive if she has to rely on socialist votes to get the measures through the Commons. The Prime Minister told the Commons she wanted to recognise the passion that the outgoing Foreign Secretary had shown in promoting a global Britain to the world. But she mounted a staunch defence of her controversial plan, saying it struck a balance between Brexit and staying close to EU partners, and was needed to ensure there was no hard Irish border. "This is the Brexit that is in our national interest," she said. To laughter, Mrs. May said there had been a spirited debate in Cabinet as there was at breakfast tables across the country. Asked by journalists afterwards if the PM would fight a no-confidence vote, her spokesman said, "Yes." The spokesman denied that the government was in meltdown. "I wouldn't agree with it. The Prime Minister sums up what we are doing and what we are about, and we are setting about that task. It is an important one to deliver for the British people," he said. Told of the resignation news, Mr. Davis said his reaction was regret and flatly denied coordinating the action with Mr. Johnson. I had resigned because this was central. This was central to my job, and if we continue with this policy and I was still there, I'd have to present it in the House of Commons. I'd have to present it in Europe. I'd have to be the champion of the policy which I didn't believe in, so that doesn't work. Somebody else can do a better job than me under those circumstances. I don't think it's central to the Foreign Secretary. It's a pity, but there we are. Some senior ministers rallied around, with Chancellor Philip Hammond tweeting, the PM making important statement in the House, and that Theresa_May's plan has my full support. It's a proposal that puts jobs first and protects our nation's prosperity. Getting the best deal for Britain. European Council President Donald Tusk hinted that he thought Brexit could now be reversed altogether. Politicians come and go, but the problems they have created for people remain. I can only regret that the idea of Brexit has not left with Davis and Johnson. But who knows? He tweeted. In a resignation announced just before midnight, Mr. Davis told the PM that her policies would leave the UK in a weak and inescapable negotiating position with just 8 months until Britain cuts ties with Brussels. As you know, there have been a significant number of occasions in the last year or so on which I have disagreed with the number 10 policy line, ranging from accepting the Commission's sequencing of negotiations through to the language on Northern Ireland and the December joint report, he said. At each stage I have accepted collective responsibility, because it is part of my task to find workable compromises, and because I considered it was still possible to deliver on the mandate of the referendum, and on our manifesto commitment to leave the customs union and the single market. I am afraid that I think the current trend of policy and tactics is making that look less and less likely. Mrs. May responded by saying, I do not agree with your characterization of the policy we agreed at Cabinet on Friday. Dear Theresa, it is more than 2 years since the British people voted to leave the European Union on an unambiguous and categorical promise that if they did so they would be taking back control of their democracy. They were told that they would be able to manage their own immigration policy, repatriate the sums of UK cash currently spent by the EU, and, above all, that they would be able to pass laws independently and in the interests of the people of this country. Brexit should be about opportunity and hope. It should be a chance to do things differently, to be more nimble and dynamic, and to maximize the particular advantages of the UK as an open, outward-looking global economy. That dream is dying, suffocated by needless self-doubt. We have postponed crucial decisions, including the preparations for no deal, as I argued in my letter to you of last November, with the result that we appear to be heading for a semi-Brexit, with large parts of the economy still locked in the EU system, but with no UK control over that system. It now seems that the opening bit of our negotiations involves accepting that we are not actually going to be able to make our own laws. Indeed, we seem to have gone backwards since the last Chequers meeting in February, when I described my frustrations, as Mayor of London, in trying to protect cyclists from juggernauts. We had wanted to lower the cabin windows to improve visibility. And even though such designs were already on the market, and even though there had been a horrific spate of deaths, mainly of female cyclists, we were told that we had to wait for the EU to legislate on the matter. So at the previous Chequers session, we thrashed out an elaborate procedure for divergence from EU rules. But even that seems to have been taken off the table, and there is in fact no easy UK right of initiative. Yet if Brexit is to mean anything, it must surely give ministers and Parliament the chance to do things differently to protect the public. If a country cannot pass a law to save the lives of female cyclists, When that proposal is supported at every level of UK government, then I don't see how that country can truly be called independent. It is also clear that by surrendering control over our rule book for goods and agri-foods, and much else besides, we will make it much more difficult to do free trade deals. And then there is the further impediment of having to argue for an impractical and undeliverable. Boris Johnson was staying tight-lipped today after his resignation drama, as his former spin doctor predicted he will try to oust Theresa May. The former Foreign Secretary has been spotted at his London home and at Parliament this afternoon after quitting in protest at the PM Third Way Brexit plan. Despite a growing clamour from Tory Eurosceptics for a move against Mrs May, aides are adamant he is not planning anything immediate. Gus O'Hare, who was his press chief, said he was certain Mr Johnson will mount a challenge for the leadership soon. But he warned that the MP, whom he worked for as London mayor, was in danger of going past his sell-by date. Mr Harry said Mr Johnson risked becoming an old boxer who was getting back in the ring when he shouldn't. He also cautioned that the ex-cabinet minister's band of supporters appeared to be diminishing. "I would never underestimate Boris, but he's now in grave danger of becoming the old boxer too desperate not to get back in the ring when he shouldn't," he wrote in an article for GQ magazine. "I've little doubt he will challenge, and he'll do so while his diminishing band of supporters are screaming for a spectacle." But the last Conservative leadership race did terrible damage. Another could be a sorry sight. Mrs May vowed defiance today as she gathered her new-look cabinet after filling the holes left by the departures of Mr Johnson and David Davis. Theresa May faces a mortal threat to her leadership of the Conservative Party and government. A Tory leadership contest can be called in one of two ways: if Mrs May resigns, or if MPs force and win a vote of no confidence in her. Calling votes of no confidence is the responsibility of the chairman of the 1922 committee, which includes all backbench Tory MPs. Chairman Graham Brady is obliged to call a vote if 15% of Tory MPs write to him calling for one, currently 48 MPs. The process is secret, and only Mr Brady knows how many letters he has received. The procedure was last used in 2003 when Ian Duncan Smith was ousted as Tory leader. If Mrs May is ousted, any MP is eligible to stand. Conservative MPs will then hold a series of ballots to whittle the list of contenders down to two, with the last place candidate dropping out in each round. The final two candidates are then offered to the Tory membership at large for an election. The Prime Minister praised the productive first meeting with her reshaped team as she tries to draw a line under the furor. She also confirmed that the white paper setting out her controversial Brexit plans will be published on Thursday. Mrs May scrambled to fill the holes in cabinet last night with a series of radical moves, shifting Jeremy Hunt to Foreign Secretary and Dominic Raab into the key Brexit Secretary role. Matt Hancock has been promoted from the Culture Department to Health Secretary as the Premier digs in for an attritional battle with Eurosceptics. Tweeting a picture of the cabinet meeting, Mrs May said, "Productive cabinet meeting this morning, looking ahead to a busy week. And sending our best wishes to England for tomorrow." Downing Street said ministers discussed the forthcoming publication of the White Paper on the future partnership with the EU and how no deal with is being stepped up. The meeting also covered Salisbury, the NATO summit, and formally congratulated the England team. In a boost for Mrs May, it emerged last night that the chair of the powerful Tory 1922 committee has yet to receive the 48 letters from MPs needed to trigger a no-confidence vote. But although she has weathered the initial shock of the resignations, furious Brexiteers have warned that a challenge could come within a week unless she changes policy. A Tory boss has issued a groveling apology to a Lib Dem MP and new mother after he broke a promise not to vote in last night's Brexit showdown so she could stay at home with her newborn. Jo Swinson, who gave birth to her son Gabriel 2 weeks ago, is on maternity leave, so she missed the crucial parliamentary showdown. Tory whips had agreed to pair her with party chairman Brandon Lewis, meaning he would also skip the vote so Miss Swinson would not be punished for having a baby. But Mr. Lewis flouted the agreement and took part in the knife-edge vote on the customs union last night. Tory bosses were terrified the Tory Remainer rebellion would inflict a humiliating defeat on the PM, leaving her Brexit plans and leadership in tatters. In the end, the government squeaked home by just 6 votes, helped across the line by Mr. Lewis' ballot and the backing of a handful of Labour leavers. Mr. Lewis and Tory Chief Whip Julian Smith last night issued a grovelling apology to the Lib Dem MP and claimed it was an honest mistake. Ms. Swinson lashed the pair on Twitter and is demanding that Parliament's rules are overhauled so mothers on maternity leave can get another MP to vote on their behalf. Writing on Twitter last night, Ms. Swinson said, "Just how low will your government stoop, Theresa May?" When Andrea Leeson delayed proxy voting motions, she assured those of us who were pregnant that we would be poured when necessary. "Today your government broke that agreement. Brandon Lewis paired with me but voted. Desperate stuff. This is calculated, deliberate breaking of trust by whips and Chief Whip Julian Smith to win at all costs." Brandon abstained in afternoon divisions, but voted in the 2 crunch votes after 6 p.m. There's a word for it: cheating. Mr. Lewis scrambled to apologize to the MP, replying on Twitter, "I'm sorry, Joe. I think it was an honest mistake made by the whips in fast-moving circumstances. I know how important the pair is to everyone, especially new parents, and I apologize. Also apologies for late reply. Been speaking at an event." Furious Tory Remainers claimed Jacob Rees-Mogg is running Britain today after failing to soften the government's Brexit stance. Rebels complained that Eurosceptics had hijacked Theresa May's premiership after a knife-edge vote on whether the UK should stay in the EU customs union. The government fended off the bid to force her hand in negotiations with Brussels by just 6 votes, with a handful of Labour Brexiteers saving her from disaster. Tory Remainer rebels mounted the attack on the trade bill after being incensed by Mrs May's decision on Monday to swallow amendments that appeared to undermine her own Chequers blueprint for future trade links. Former Minister Anna Soubry said whips had threatened to trigger a general election if the government had lost the customs union vote. She told the BBC Radio 4 Today programme, "These nonsenses of threatening general elections and votes of confidence in the Prime Minister, and as I actually said to the Deputy Chief Whip, bring it on, because I shall be the first in the queue to give my vote of full confidence in the Prime Minister. Problem is, I don't think that she's in charge anymore. I've no doubt Jacob Rees-Mogg is running our country." And Mr Smith, who was in charge of telling Tory MPs how to vote, and when to stay away from the division lobbies, also apologized. He wrote, "Yo, I am sorry I spoke to your Chief Whip earlier. A mistake. We pair consistently 4 pregnancy pairs." But when challenged by Ms Swinson to explain exactly how Mr Lewis managed to accidentally vote in the crunch showdowns when he had correctly stayed away from votes earlier in the day, he stayed silent. The row has sparked fury among MPs, with Labour and Tory MPs slamming the Tory frontbench for the blunder. And it has fueled demands for Westminster's antiquated rules to be reformed so that the same does not happen to other mothers at home with their newborn babies. An urgent question on the issue is being tabled in Parliament today. It means MPs will be able to quiz a minister on the blunder and demand to know how proposed reforms are coming along. Tory MP Sarah Wollaston, chairwoman of the Health Select Committee, said, who is taking responsibility for failing to honor the pairing agreement for Jo Swinson, who is on maternity leave. More than just an extension of the other heavy-handed tactics on display, it disrespects women and why maternity leave matters. Labour MP Yvette Cooper, who wrote on Twitter, nearly 10,000 outraged viewers have signed a petition demanding the petty BBC brings back competition show The Great Pottery Throwdown. The 8-part series, which followed a group of hopefuls as they battled it out for the title of Top Potter, drew in up to 2.5 million viewers last year. But earlier this week it was revealed that despite consistent ratings, the broadcaster had axed the popular program from its BBC Two schedule. The show, which was presented by Sarah Cox and ran for 2 years from 2015, is made by Love Productions, the company also behind The Great British Bake Off. TV sources have suggested that the broadcaster has not recommissioned the program due to sour grapes with Love Productions after the company sold the baking show to rival broadcaster Channel 4 as part of a £75 million deal. Now a petition calling for the broadcaster to bring back The Great Pottery Throwdown has gained 9,600 signatures. Likely to go up, it accuses the BBC of cutting the program out of spite and urges the corporation to consider the license fee payer deciding to axe popular shows. The BBC have decided, out of spite for losing The Great British Bake Off, to axe The Great Pottery Throwdown, the petition reads. The public should have more say in what the corporation does and how they spend our money. So stop being petty and bring back popular programs. Fans who signed the petition described the decision to axe the show as a tragedy and a terrible shame. One wrote, a shocking, spiteful decision with no regard to the views of license fee payers. Meanwhile, another said the show had resulted in pottery and ceramics classes being oversubscribed. The show, which was filmed at Midleport Pottery, is also said to have helped boost tourism to Stoke-on-Trent. BBC Two controller Patrick Holland has commissioned a second series of the Big Family Cooking Showdown, which drew in an average audience of 1.4 million, and £1 Million Menu, which had an average audience of just 800,000. One insider told The Mirror, Pottery Throwdown did really well on BBC Two, they were a perfect fit. It just seems incredible that it won't return when other shows that haven't done nearly so well are being brought back. You've to wonder whether this isn't all just sour grapes over Bake Off going to Channel 4. When asked whether the broadcaster would review its decision, a BBC spokeswoman said, whilst we are proud of The Great Pottery Throwdown this is a shocking moment. A woman allegedly stole a car and crashed into multiple vehicles before getting out and diving into a marina. The bizarre incident unfolded in Bristol, just before 9 p.m. on Monday night, after police were called following reports a car was being driven erratically. One witness who watched the incident from her bedroom window said the woman hit around 10 cars, almost ran over a young girl, before jumping into the water and being detained by police on a boat. The witness, who asked not to be named, said, she got into a Mazda MX-5, locked the door and then drove off. She can't drive and couldn't get it out at first. She came around and crashed into a taxi, then she reversed and crashed into it again. Then she put her foot down and came up onto the pavement. There was 2 girls there who were about 13. She missed the second girl by inches. As she came on the curb, one girl ran around the corner, but the other girl was still there, and the car was coming along the pavement. She was running along the pavement to get away from it when the car hit a lamp post, which then fell over. She wasn't stopping for anyone. She was back on the road and tried to drive off and then crashed into another car. Then she went to Sainsbury's roundabout, I think. Apparently she hit another 5 cars. Then she headed back to the marina and jumped in, and then she was running down and ended up on the boat. The witness said the woman had been visiting a friend who lives on a boat in the marina, and that it was his car. According to reports, the man was trying to get the woman, who was believed to be intoxicated, out of the car. These videos posted on Facebook show the incident from another angle and appear to show the woman being held at the marina while people awaited the arrival of the police. Avon and Somerset police were called to the scene at around 9:45 p.m. after reports a woman had been driving erratically. No one was injured in the incident. A spokesperson for police said, "We were called at about 8:45 p.m. last night to reports of a car being driven erratically in the Newfoundland Road area of Portishead. A number of vehicles were damaged, as well as a lamppost and street furniture. The car was left on a roundabout in Phoenix Way, and the woman driver ran towards the Portishead Key Marina Lake, where she was detained by officers shortly afterwards." A British Airways flight carrying 214 people from London to Mumbai has made an emergency landing at an airport in Azerbaijan after its engine failed. The captain of flight BAW 199 requested an emergency landing at Baku's Haydar Aliyev Airport after a failure of the left engine on the Boeing 777, the airport said. The airline said in a statement that the decision to divert the plane was made following a technical issue. The plane landed safely at around 6:30 a.m. local time on Thursday and no one was hurt. The passengers were taken to the airport's transit zone and were given food and drink, according to the airport. A British Airways spokesman told Mail Online on Thursday afternoon that a replacement aircraft will land in Baku shortly. However, Twitter users complained that they were not being updated on their situation by the airline and also about the lack of food and drink being offered to stranded passengers. One passenger said that since landing in Baku, the airline's staff have yet to provide information. "Since we disembarked, not a single member if the BA crew has bothered to show their faces or check about the passengers, provide information, check if any old people or children are unwell. Frankly shocking." Another passenger also claimed there was absolutely no support for passengers. Flight 199 from LHR to Mumbai stranded in Azerbaijan after engine failure. Info: 12h delay. Absolutely no support for passengers. You need to work with local airlines to get food/water and more information to your passengers. A British Airways spokesman told Mail Online that passengers have been offered 2 meals while they wait. "We understand our customers' frustrations at the delay after the captain took the decision to divert the aircraft following a technical issue," she said. "Safety is always our first priority. A replacement aircraft will land in Baku shortly, so that we can get our customers on their way. We have offered them 2 meals during the wait to make them as comfortable as possible. It is understood that passengers have been in." Catherine Ryan has shared her daughter's hilarious reaction to her first sex education lesson, revealing there was a lot of angry crying. The comedian, 35, told her Twitter followers that her 8-year-old daughter Violet had had her first sex education lesson in school. Catherine joked that she felt the need to warn other parents of children in Year 4 that they too might be getting the talk at school, which she said left Violet and her classmates disgusted. She advised parents to get your story straight and be prepared for questions from baffled little ones. Her wry remarks prompted her followers to share their own stories of their children's reaction to their first foray into sex education. The Canadian star advised parents to plan what they'd say to their children about sex ahead of time before they come home having learned about it from school. She tweeted, "Heads up if you have kids in year 4. They taught them about sex today and there was a lot of angry crying and disgust. Get your story straight 'cause the minute you get home, you're in big trouble, sick." She later joked that she'd swerved it by telling Violet she was adopted. Catherine's light-hearted tweet amassed thousands of likes and retweets, as other parents were inspired to share their own funny stories. One tweeted, "A few years ago my son came home and proudly announced, 'I know everything there is to know about Virginias.' One of ours asked if you had to go to hospital to do it. Imagine." Another posted. A third wrote, "When my son had them he came home, shook his head at me and said, 'I can't believe you have done a disgusting with my dad.'" Another revealed, "The video they showed my daughter included a cartoon of a man chasing a woman around a bed with a peacock feather. She's going to have unusual expectations." Catherine was born in Ontario, Canada but now lives in Crouch End, London with her daughter. She has appeared on 8 out of 10 Cats and Mock the Week, as well as in her own Netflix special, Catherine Ryan, In Trouble. Earlier this year Catherine was praised by her followers when she came out in support of repealing the 8th Amendment in the Irish abortion referendum. Catherine was then trolled by No voters, who told her she shouldn't get involved in the country's politics. She fired back by proving that she is entitled to hold an opinion because she has an Irish passport as her father and grandparents are Irish. She took a snap of herself holding the passport and told the troll. Bungling fly tippers were caught dumping waste outside a CCTV company's warehouse. Cameras at DCP Total Solutions in Dewsbury, West Yorkshire, captured crystal clear footage of the incident. But the firm was told neither police nor Kirklees Council could do anything as it occurred on private land. Video shows men throwing mattresses, foam and bedding parts on the ground after arriving at site in a van on July 1. The cameras captured the van's registration as well as the identities of those involved. Though West Yorkshire Police won't act, the council has now said it will investigate. David Lowles, a director at DCP Total Solutions, said all the waste appeared to be linked to a bed manufacturing company. And he said the individuals who dumped it seemed to have targeted what they thought was a blind spot in the industrial estate's security systems. "It seemed like they knew where they were going," he said. "We've got cameras on view around the building but the one that's filmed the incident is hidden. They must have known the area as they've gone straight there and thought that they weren't on CCTV. If you wake up to the sight of rubbish that has been fly-tipped, the proper response is to call your local council, not the police. The police will only prosecute if they catch tippers in the act and so you should call 999 if you see it taking place before you. If you are calling a council about fly tipping after it has taken place, then they can take the matter to court. But if rubbish is dumped on private land, the local authority is not required to remove it and the responsibility rests with the landowner. Victims should contact the Environment Agency if the waste is more than 20 tons. More than 5 cubic meters of fibrous asbestos or 75 liters of potentially hazardous waste in drums or containers. If the waste is linked to crime or organized crime then it should also be reported to the Environment Agency. Sources: gov.uk and herts.police.uk. We were flabbergasted when we saw it. The amount of stuff they've dumped is unbelievable. The high-top van was packed to the rafters. The first thing we did was review the CCTV, and we thought, hallelujah, we've got the van and the registration plate on camera, so it'll be an easy job for the police to collar them. But it didn't turn out that way, and when the police turned up a week later we found out it's not a police matter. We contacted the council and they said they couldn't do anything, so we thought we were in a stalemate. The council has now come, perhaps as the video has been on Facebook, and they've said they'll look into it. But they still can't clear up the mess. That's something we're going to have to pay for. The video has been viewed and shared hundreds of times on social media in a bid to help identify the suspects. If Kirklees Council finds the culprits, it can prosecute them in court. A drunken mother, who had been tranquilized before she got on a plane, rummaged through lockers in a desperate search for alcohol before launching a mid-air attack on her husband. Sharon Simonite, 46, lost control after being refused 4 glasses of wine on an EasyJet flight to Liverpool from Mallorca. Her outburst, which led to police meeting her on the John Lennon Airport runway, came even though she had been tranquilized by doctors before boarding her plane. Trouble erupted after Simonite arrived at the island's Palma airport at around 9 p.m. on the night of April 13. Her husband, Martin, noticed a change in her behavior after she disappeared to the toilets for between 5 and 10 minutes. Having spotted 3/4 of a bottle of sangria in her bag before they left for the airport, he believed she had spent that time drinking the contents, which she denied. She then suffered a fall, which led to doctors treating her bruising with ice and taking the decision to give the upset and angry 46-year-old a tranquilizer. By 11 p.m., the couple were sitting near the back of the flight with one of their young children. Alan Crumbs, prosecuting, said the defendant was calm until cabin crew began to serve passengers. He told Liverpool Magistrates Court, the defendant suddenly became alert and attempted to get the attention of a cabin crew member and asked for 4 wines. When the request was refused, staff telling Simonite they did not serve alcohol, she became angry and accused her husband of telling flight crew not to serve her. She then left her seat and went to the plane galley, opening lockers before crew stepped in. Mr. Curran said, once she got back to them, her husband and child, she began to swear at Mr. Simonite. She then began to hit him to the right arm with a clenched fist. She hit him 5 or 6 times. Her husband was not injured, but believed she was trying to hit him as hard as she could. Cabin crew intervened and Mr. Simonite and the couple's son were moved to seats at the front of the plane. The court heard Simonite had been drinking heavily for years and also suffered an eating disorder. Her husband told officers she was often verbally abusive, and Mr. Currams added, "It causes him great upset the matter has come this far, but, for his and his children's safety, he believes the defendant needs more help." Simonite, of Mid-Lewich, Cheshire, admitted being drunk on an aircraft and assaulting her husband. Paul White, defending, said, she accepts she was drunk when going to the airport and hadn't eaten for 10 days throughout the holiday period. He said she was an anxious flyer and that she had shown remorse, but he questioned why she was allowed to fly, considering her behavior before her flight. He said she was clearly a vulnerable woman who was getting help from her GP and had not had a drink for 4 days before the court hearing. Sentencing her to 8 weeks in jail, suspended for 2 years, Chair of the bench Paul Walsh told Simonite, "While the court acknowledges that you had some issues, this does not excuse your behavior or make your offenses less serious." Simonite was also handed a rehabilitation order. Archaeologists in Egypt will open a 10-feet-long sarcophagus dug up in the city where Alexander the Great may have been buried. The 6.5-feet-high coffin was unearthed in Alexandria, which is built on the city founded by the legendary leader. Also found in the tomb that contained it was a bust made from alabaster, whose features had eroded into obscurity. Egyptologists determined the tomb belonged to a nobleman as opposed to a king, the Daily Telegraph reports. Some historians believe Alexander's remains could one day be discovered on top of the modern city, which is built on the ancient settlement he established. Antiques Ministry officials say the sarcophagus has been sealed for more than 2,000 years. An undisturbed layer of mortar sits between its lid and the body of the coffin. Questions as to the identity of the person inside persist due to the worn bust and the absence of any written inscriptions on the sarcophagus. Scientists say it belonged to a rich or noble man who lived between 323 BC and 30 BC. This was the time Rome seized Egypt, and after the death of Cleopatra. Leading Egyptologist and former Antiquities Minister Zahi Hawass said it should belong to someone important. It is a granite sarcophagus. For someone to bring granite from Aswan, 600 miles south, means he would have had to have been rich. But the tomb is said to be too small for a king like Alexander, as bigger ones have been found to contain Roman nobles. When used it would be open-surfaced online. American author Catherine. England's heartbreaking loss in the World Cup semi-final was the most-watched TV event since the 2012 Olympics, viewing figures reveal. A peak of 26.5 million people tuned into ITV last night for England's monumental game against Croatia, which saw the national team crash out after extra time. An average of 24.3 million viewed the match on television, while a further 4.3 million tuned in via ITV Hub through mobile phones, tablets and laptops. The figures made the game the most-watched broadcast in Britain since the opening ceremony of the London Olympics in 2012, which was viewed by 27.3 million. 1. World Cup Final 1966, 2. Diana's Funeral 1997, 3. Royal Family Documentary 1969, 4. Apollo 13 Descent 1970, 5. FA Cup Final Replay 1970, 6. Charles and Diana's Wedding 1981, 7. Princess Anne's Wedding 1973, 8. London 2012 Closing Ceremony 9. England v Croatia 2018, 10. London 2012 Opening Ceremony 32.30 million. Average viewers 32.10 million, 30.69 million, 28.60 million, 28.49 million, 28.40 million, 27.60 million, 24.46 million, 24.30 million, 24.24 million. Incredibly, the statistics for last night's game do not include the hundreds of thousands who watched the match in pubs and on big screens at venues all over England. More than 30,000 people packed out Hyde Park in London during the match, while city squares up and down the country hosted similar events. The peak viewership of the game was recorded at 26.5 million, for 5 minutes at the end of extra time, from 9:30 p.m. to 9:35 p.m. The overall match average for the semi-final was 24.2 million, which made it better watched than both the opening and closing ceremonies at London 2012. Earlier in the tournament, 23 million people tuned in to watch England play Colombia in the round of 16, more than the number who watched the royal wedding. At its peak, 12.2 million were watching the match on ITV, with another 10.2 million watching on HD and up. A 91-year-old is believed to be the nation's oldest drink driver after she admitted drunkenly crashing her high-powered car. Pauline Horrigan smashed the Audi A3 Sportback into bollards and a lamppost in Colchester, Essex, last month. The pensioner failed 2 breathalyzer tests and arrested on suspicion of drink driving. Today, she admitted drink driving and pledged to give up her car when her 14-month ban expires, after 76 years behind the wheel. Horgan, of West Mersey, struggled to hear the proceedings and repeatedly asked solicitors to speak up in Colchester Magistrates Court. Horgan, who turns 92 this week, was recorded with 47 micrograms of alcohol in 100 milliliters of breath, just over the legal limit of 35. Prosecutor Danielle Jones told Magistrates Court that Horgan complied with cops after she was arrested. She said, at 8:15 in the evening on Sunday 3 June the defendant drove her grey Audi along Abbots Road, Colchester, where it is said she lost control and collided with the central reservation island, causing her vehicle damage and damage to the street furniture. Police arrived and the roadside test was complied with and came back as positive. The defendant was arrested and taken to Colchester Police Station. She gave 2 samples of breath, both being 47 and 100 milliliters of breath. Graham Brown, defending, passed a letter to the bench and said his client deeply regretted the crash and will not apply for her license when her disqualification expires. He said, "She deeply regrets this incident. Total remorse, as you can see from this letter she has written. She is a lady who has driven 76 years without an accident in previous court appearance. As you have seen, she has taken the decision she is not going to drive again." Chair of the bench Brenda Pierce credited Horgan's guilty plea, but stripped her of her license and ordered her to pay costs of £319. Horgan is older than the 2 previous oldest drink drivers who were banned in English courts. In 2014, 85-year-old grandmother Betty Teague was said to be the oldest woman drink driver in the country after being convicted. David By, 88, was said to be the oldest male drink driver after he was. The EU has signed its biggest ever free trade deal with Japan, hailing it as a clear message against protectionism in a swipe at US President Donald Trump. The deal, signed in Tokyo by the EU's top officials and Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, creates a free trade zone covering nearly a third of the world's GDP. It comes as Trump continues to unsettle allies and provoke rivals with his aggressive America First trade policy. Both the EU and Japan have been hit with new US tariffs despite their long-standing alliances with Washington. The deal was also struck amid turmoil in Britain, with the UK yet to agree how its final trading relationship with the EU will work after Brexit. Japan's Ambassador for International Economic Affairs, Yoichi Suzuki, has previously said it was a very high priority that the deal enter force before the end of March 2019, referring to the date when Britain is set to leave the EU. The European Commission had also hoped the deal could come into force before Brexit. It was previously reported that if the deal does enter into force before Brexit, it could apply automatically to Britain during a post-March 2019 transition period of around 2 years. This morning, EU Council President Donald Tusk said of the deal, "We are sending a clear message that we stand together against protectionism." Commission head Jean-Claude Juncker added, "Together we are making, by signing this agreement, a statement about free and fair trade. We are showing that we are stronger and better off when we work together." Juncker said the deal sent a message that trade is about more than tariffs and barriers, it is about values. "There is no protection in protectionism," he said. Abe, standing alongside the 2 EU officials, said the agreement shows the world the unshaken political will of Japan and the EU to lead the world as the champions of free trade at a time when protectionism has spread. The signing was delayed from earlier this month because Abe cancelled going to Brussels over a disaster in southwestern Japan caused by extremely heavy rainfall, with more than 200 people dying in floods and landslides. Both sides are heralding the deal, which covers a third of the global economy and more than 600 million people. Prices of European wine and pork will fall for Japanese consumers, while Japanese machinery parts, tea and fish will become cheaper for Europe. The deal eliminates about 99% of the tariffs on Japanese goods to the EU, but remaining at around 94% for European imports into Japan for now and rising to 99% over the years. The difference is due to exceptions such as rice, a product which is culturally and politically sensitive and has been protected for decades in Japan. The major step toward liberalizing trade has been discussed in talks since 2013. But the timing of the signing is striking as China and the US are embroiled in trade conflicts. The US is proposing 10% tariffs on a $200 billion £151 billion list of Chinese goods. That follows an earlier move by Washington to impose 25% tariffs on $34 billion £25 billion of Chinese goods. Beijing has responded by imposing identical penalties on a similar amount of American imports. Besides the latest deal with the EU, Japan is working on other trade agreements, including a far-reaching Trans-Pacific deal. The partnership includes Australia, Mexico, Vietnam and other nations, although the US has withdrawn. Japan praised the deal with the EU as coming from Mr. Abe's Abenomics policies, designed to wrest the economy out of stagnation despite a shrinking population and cautious spending. Japan's growth continues to be heavily dependent on exports. The Foreign Ministry said that by strengthening ties with the EU, Japan hopes to vitalize mutual direct investment, fight other global trends toward protectionism, and enhance the stature of Japanese brands. The EU said the trade liberalization will lead to the region's export growth in chemicals, clothing, cosmetics and beer to Japan, leading to job security for Europe. Japan will get cheaper cheese, such as Parmesan, Gouda and cheddar, as well as chocolate and biscuits. Japanese consumers have historically coveted European products, and a drop. This is the moment a pair of bungling jewelry thieves had their escape plan foiled by a woman who stole the keys from their getaway bike parked outside the shop. The shocked robbers, armed with a wheel wrench and a hammer, tried to snatch them back from the brave woman but gave up before trying to flee. One of the men was tackled to the floor by an off-duty police officer, but the second man escaped with a number of watches and pieces of jewelry. Police are now hunting the second man following the robbery in Colchester, Essex yesterday. Onlooker, Jody Brown, 22, who caught the failed escape on camera outside Chimes jewelry store, said she felt like she was in a crime documentary. She said, "I was walking past down the street and I saw the commotion happening and pointed the bike out to my other half. He looked in the direction and noticed the men had masks on, so he pulled me away." If you watch television at the moment, there have been so many documentaries and stories about moped robberies. So he told me to pull my phone out and start recording just in case something happened, and he was right. It was just like what we watched on TV a few nights before. The one thief tried to snatch back the keys from a woman but couldn't get them back. One man has been charged with robbery and will appear at Colchester Magistrates Court tomorrow. An Essex police spokesman said, "The second man, who is being hunted by police, was described as wearing a gray-colored tracksuit, black trainers and a white motorcycle helmet. He ran off in the direction of Scarregate Steps." Anyone with information is asked to contact Colchester City on one. The Red Arrows showed off daring acrobatics as they flew over Somerset to cap a magnificent 5-hour flying display at the Yeovil Air Day this weekend. More than 40,000 people visited the Royal Naval Air Station to watch the display on a gloriously sunny Saturday and enjoyed flypasts from an array of aircraft including F-16 seconds, Red Arrows and Wildcat helicopters. Chinooks and Typhoons were on display from the Royal Air Force, while there were also planes from Belgium, Canada, France and other foreign militaries for enthusiasts to see. Revelers also had the chance to fly in helicopters for a £35 round trip with spectacular views over the Somerset countryside. Organizers said, "Our aim is to display, either flying or static." Families are being urged to have the measles vaccine before going on holiday amid a surge in cases across Europe. Experts are particularly concerned about those who may have missed out on the jab during the MMR scare of the early 2000s. Many will be shortly heading for southern Europe, where measles rates are very high. The worst affected countries include Greece, Italy and Romania, while Germany, France and Serbia are also experiencing unusually high rates. Health officials are worried that Britons will catch measles abroad and bring the illness back to the UK. Measles rates in England are already high, and earlier this month Public Health England urged GPs to be extra vigilant. There have been 729 confirmed cases of measles in England so far this year, compared with 274 cases in the whole of 2017. In Europe, cases rose fourfold last year compared with 2016. The warning to holidaymakers has been issued by public health experts at the Royal College of Nursing, which is especially worried about those heading for music festivals, as measles spreads quickly in confined spaces. The RCN's Helen Donovan said, "Getting immunized is quick and simple. An appointment with your practice nurse will only take a few minutes. The MMR vaccine is free and will help prevent the spread of a particularly infectious and unpleasant disease." Uptake of the vaccine, normally given at the age of 1 and again at 3 or 4, plummeted in the late 1990s and early 2000s following a man who planted a nail bomb outside his neighbor's home in a brothel row boasted of his party lifestyle after going on the run to Tenerife for a year. David Perry, 27, was charged with leaving the bomb packed with petrol, nails, and pieces of concrete in a glass bottle outside the home of Alexander McCluskey. But before appearing in court, he traveled to the Canary Islands for a holiday and stayed a full year despite a warrant being issued for his arrest in Scotland. While he was soaking up the sunshine and partying, he was also working in a bar to fund his lifestyle. Perry shared dozens of snaps on social media showing him partying with groups of friends who seemed unaware he was avoiding justice back home. He posed with boxers Carl Frampton and Stephen Ward in one photo as they enjoyed a break away from the boxing ring. Others showed him holding a bottle of Buckfast, playing mini-golf, and relaxing on the beach in the sunshine. And another showed him outside the bar where he worked dressed as a nurse as revelers party. Eventually he returned to Scotland after spending a year abroad and was finally arrested at the airport. He traveled knowing full well that he had a court appearance coming up but decided to stay on and work when the chance came up, a source said. He ended up staying for an entire year and lived life to the full before deciding to come home, and that is when justice caught up with him in Scotland. Perry, from Glasgow, appeared at Hamilton Sheriff Court and admitted leaving the makeshift bomb at the flat in August 2015 and failing to appear in court last June. The court heard Mr. McCluskey stayed next door to Perry's girlfriend Louise Stewart in Hamilton, Lanarkshire. But relations between the group soured when Miss Stewart made a malicious call to the SPCA about McCluskey's pet dog. Months later, police arrested Miss Stewart after they were told she was operating a brothel from the flat, but she was released without charge. Perry suspected Mr. McCluskey called police, and hours after Stewart was released, He smashed the neighbor's front window and left the glass bottle, which had a strong smell of fuel coming from it, and a lighter outside. The bar worker was arrested after neighbors gave police a description, and his DNA was discovered on the bottle. Sheriff Sheena Waldron released Perry on bail and deferred sentence for reports after being told he had made a mistake and realized he was wrong to leave the country. "You were extremely foolish on a number of counts," she said. The House of Commons was suspended today as furious MPs raged at the government over its Brexit plans. Speaker John Bercow took the rare move as MPs demanded they have time to see a 98-page Brexit plan before asking questions about it. Brexit Secretary Dominic Raab was forced to stop his statements setting out the controversial plans after they were not handed out in advance. Amid angry protests, Mr. Raab was allowed to resume his statement after 5 minutes. MPs could be seen throwing copies of the long-awaited plan around the Commons in a desperate effort to see it before Mr. Bercow ordered a break in proceedings. The long-awaited plan suggests EU workers will continue to be allowed to temporarily come to Britain without a visa, something many will see as an effective continuation of free movement. It also warns the planned trade deal with Brussels will fall apart if Britain ever diverges from EU rules on goods. A joint panel of British and EU officials, which can take advice from the European Court, will rule on disputes. The document also paves the way for Britain joining an association agreement with the EU, the same status held by countries like Ukraine, and likely to be seen by Brexiteers as a step back toward membership. The plans have threatened to derail Theresa May's government since they were agreed by the cabinet a week ago. Boris Johnson and David Davis resigned in protest, claiming that the plans betray the 2016 referendum vote. EU negotiator Michel Barnier welcomed the plans and said he looked forward to resuming negotiations next week. Despite the proposals for free travel for workers and tourists, Mr. Raab insisted we are going to take back control of our immigration policy, telling MPs he was confident a deal is within reach. The plans published today would mean the plan envisages the creation of a new governing body of ministers from both sides, meeting twice a year, including one summit of the British PM with leaders of the remaining 27 member states and heads of EU institutions, to oversee the agreement and discuss proposals for change. Key features of the future framework plan include a joint committee would underpin technical and administrative functions, with a robust, independent arbitration panel to decide on disputes, ensuring that rulings on differences between the UK and EU are not made by the courts of either side. Crucially, the panel would be able to seek guidance from the European Court of Justice, but only on the interpretation of EU law. But as Brexiteers stepped up their rhetoric today, Maria Caulfield, who has quit as a Tory vice chair, branded the proposals catastrophically bad and a disaster. And MPs complained to Speaker John Bercow they had not been given advance sight of the document before they are supposed to question Mr. Raab about it. Ahead of publication, Mr. Raab said the UK would be ending free movement but visas would be a part of future trade deals. He said concerns raised by Brussels had been listened to and the government was approaching the talks in a spirit of friendship. But he refused to say if the white paper was an opening offer to the EU or the UK's red lines. "I don't really want to get into all of that, but we need to crack on," he said. He added, "We are going to take back control of our immigration policy. There will be a negotiation about the details when the immigration bill is set out," he said. She said a small cabal in Downing Street were showing contempt for the opinions of MPs. Meanwhile, details of an alternative white paper that was being drawn up by Mr. Davis have been released, which would have called for the UK and EU to have mutual recognition of standards on goods rather than a stricter common rulebook. Critics claim the more restrictive approach adopted by Mrs. May will prevent a deep trade deal with the US. Writing in The Sun, Mrs. May pleaded with rebels to back down, saying her plan was the only one which truly respects the will of the British people. The newly installed Brexit secretary insisted the much-anticipated White Paper would not leave the UK as a rule-taker and respects the referendum result while backing business. Mr. Robb is taking the document to EU chief negotiator Michel Barnier later as the government makes an all-out bid to break the deadlock in negotiations. But it is far from clear that the plans will get a good reception in Brussels, after Mr. Barnier warned they must be workable and urged business leaders to prepare for a no-deal scenario. Eurosceptics are plotting to inflict a series of Commons defeats on Theresa May next week as they step up their guerrilla war. They have tabled 4 amendments to the PM's flagship trade bill that could stop her enacting the plan agreed by the cabinet at Chequers. Rival Brexit plans that were being proposed by David Davis before his resignation have been leaked. The alternative White Paper would have called for the UK and EU to have mutual recognition of standards on goods rather than the stricter common rulebook mooted by Theresa May. Critics claim the more restrictive approach adopted by Mrs. May will prevent a deep trade deal with the US. The draft of Mr. Davis's version, leaked to the Conservative Home website, claims that mutual recognition and alignment have been agreed in free trade arrangements between the EU and Canada. It adds that stand-alone mutual recognition agreements are in place with New Zealand, the US and Australia. The plan states, UK law may not necessarily be identical to EU law, but it should achieve the same outcomes. This commitment means that in practice, UK and EU regulatory standards will remain substantially similar in the future. The revolt could wipe out Mrs. May's majority when the legislation returns to the Commons on Monday, in the first significant test of strength of her Brexit critics. The Prime Minister faces a war on 2 fronts as Remain supporting Tories led by Dominic Grieve are also planning their own amendments to keep Britain tied closely to the EU. Jacob Rees-Mogg, the chairman of the European Research Group of Eurosceptic Tory backbenchers, last night said the Chequers plan had led to a breakdown in trust. He warned that Mrs. May must now perform a U-turn or rely on Labour votes to get her legislation through Parliament. Mr. Rees-Mogg said the amendments would help rescue us from the failure of Chequers, adding, "We are hoping to help the government stick to its previous commitments." A source added that a series of defeats would act as a warning shot to Mrs. May by Brexiteers over her Chequers blueprint. He said, "The government has a very small majority, and there are quite a lot of people who want a proper Brexit. The government forgot that at Chequers." Writing in the Daily Telegraph, Miss Caulfield said, "Instead of exploring this perfectly acceptable solution, a small cabal in Downing Street has dreamt up a fiendishly complex arrangement that seeks to recreate large parts of the EU's single market. This approach comes with serious costs." Theresa May faces a mortal threat to her leadership of the Conservative Party and government. A Tory leadership contest can be called in one of 2 ways: if Mrs. May resigns, or if MPs force and win a vote of no confidence in her. Calling votes of no confidence is the responsibility of the chairman of the 1922 committee, which includes all backbench Tory MPs. Chairman Graham Brady is obliged to call a vote if 15% of Tory MPs write to him calling for one, currently 48 MPs. The process is secret, and only Mr. Brady knows how many letters he has received. The procedure was last used in 2003 when Ian Duncan Smith was ousted as Tory leader. If Mrs. May is ousted, any MP is eligible to stand. Conservative MPs will then hold a series of ballots to whittle the list of contenders down to 2, with the last place candidate dropping out in each round. The final 2 candidates are then offered to the Tory membership at large for an election. Far from threatening the PM the way a handful of colleagues selfishly have ever since the country voted to leave the EU, I have loyally supported her in difficult times. While I did not expect my loyalty to be rewarded, nor did I expect it to be treated with contempt. Jeremy Hunt, who has replaced Mr. Johnson as Foreign Secretary, tried to play down the tensions. You're going to have very lively debates in a situation like this. This is one of the biggest decisions that we have taken as a country in our political lifetimes, so there's going to be a pretty fierce discussion, but the Prime Minister has found a way forward, he told reporters at a NATO summit in Brussels. He also laid down a warning to the EU, insisting, "We're not the only ones who can't do the cherry picking. If they want a deep and special partnership with Britain going forward, then we have to look at our relationship as a whole." Mr. Robb said the Chequers showdown had produced a credible proposal. "It's bold, it's ambitious, but it's also pragmatic," he told BBC Radio 4's Today programme. The Prime Minister is in charge of the negotiations. I will be deputising for her and I plan to speak to Michel Barnier later today. Mr. Robb said he hoped the white paper being published by the government would reassure all of those with concerns about this. For those that are either criticising or carping or whatever else, they need to come back with credible alternatives, he said. Mr. Robb said it was true that the UK would no longer be part of setting the directives in the common rule book it would agree to under the proposals. But he said Britain would have a chance to influence it and there would be a parliamentary lock on new measures. "It's not right to say we will be a rule taker in the sense that's normally used," he added. Ahead of the release of the white paper, Mr. Barnier told the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, "We will look carefully at each and any proposal of UK, but these proposals must be workable." However, Mr. Barnier said, "Only the combination of the single market and the customs union makes frictionless trade possible. Outside of the customs union there need to be procedures and customs controls." France are winning the battle against Belgium for a place in the World Cup final against England or Croatia, and players' wives and girlfriends are leading the support in the stands of St. Petersburg. Centre-back Samuel Umtiti scored the first goal of the game with the first 6 minutes of the second half. A host of Premier League stars are on show in the first semi-final, at which President Emmanuel Macron was pictured greeting Queen Mathilde and King Philippe. Maria Solau's, girlfriend of France's Paul Pogba of France, has been spotted in the stands at St. Petersburg Stadium alongside Charlotte Perroni, girlfriend of Florian Thauvin. Tomorrow England will face Croatia in the second semi-final in what has been the Three Lions' best World Cup in 28 years. Captain Harry Kane said he and his men were determined to make fans back home proud. "We know there is a big game ahead with the semi-final, but we are feeling good and we're confident," he told the BBC. "We just have to go again. We are enjoying it and we've got to keep doing what we are doing and make the country proud." Coach Gareth Southgate said the Gurkhas are set to open up their ranks to women for the first time. The group, who have served in the British Army for more than 200 years, will allow female soldiers to join from next year, but they will have to pass the same grueling selection test the men do. Those hoping to win a place in the regiment, seen as a golden ticket for many in Nepal, will have to pass a Doka race which involves carrying a 4-stone bag of sand for 3 miles up a hill in less than 48 minutes. Hopefuls who are selected to become Gurkhas then head to British shores to take up a 10-week course in Catterick, North Yorkshire. The village could be welcoming women from spring 2020. as well as extensive fitness training. Those that make it have English language and culture lessons on top of learning infantry skills. A scheme was piloted by the Ministry of Defense in 2007, when around 50 Nepalese women took part in fitness tests, but ultimately the brigade remained closed. Gurkhas begin on a starting salary of £18,000 and a pension, plus the right to settle in the UK. A huge wage by Nepali standards. Currently 3,000 Gurkhas serve in the British Army, and about 250 are recruited a year from Pokhara, central Nepal. But Army officers have drawn up plans to add another 800 troops to the force, according to the Sunday Times. Defense Secretary Gavin Williamson said, "The Gurkhas are renowned as one of the best fighting forces in the world with a proud history of serving Her Majesty, and it is right that women have the opportunity to serve in this elite group. Becoming a Gurkha is a great source of pride to Nepalese families, but first young recruits have to tackle a grueling fitness test, called the Doko. Young Nepali men and from next year women aged 17-21 will need to have their standard school leaving certificate and proof they are a Nepalese citizen before applying. Height is also important, they must be at least 5 feet 2 in. Dental hygiene is also important as recruits cannot have more than 4 fillings, gaps or false teeth. All previous injuries are carefully scrutinized before the fitness tests take place. Historically, applicants have even been rejected due to having had laser eye surgery. As for the fitness, wannabe Gurkhas need to be able to run 800 meters in 2 minutes and 45 seconds and be able to do 12 pull-ups and 70 sit-ups. Their language skills is also important, and they will need to face an interview that is half in English. Then comes the final Doko race, where recruits carry 4 stone of sand up a 3-mile hill in less than 48 minutes. Better to die than be a coward is the motto of the fearsome Nepalese Gurkha soldiers. They were first recruited by Britain in 1815 to ensure that they did not fight for Nepal, with which the British East India Company was then at war. A hasty peace deal had just been signed after the company suffered heavy casualties during the invasion of Nepal. This allowed it to recruit from the ranks of the former enemy. When the East India Company's forces mutinied in 1857, the loyalty of the Gurkhas made them central to British rule. They policed India's northern hills with their tactical skills and were expected to continue serving for India when the country secured its independence in 1947. It made religious sense, because Nepal was officially Hindu and would also have allowed Nepalese to easily return home on leave. However, following the partition of India, an agreement between Nepal, India and Britain meant 4 Gurkha regiments from the Indian Army were transferred to the British Army, eventually becoming the Gurkha Brigade. The name Gurkha comes from the hill town of Gorkha from which the Nepalese kingdom had expanded. The brigade has always been dominated by 4 ethnic groups, the Gurungs and Magars from central Nepal, the Rai from the northeast and Limbus from the east. The latter live in villages of impoverished hill farmers. More than 200,000 Gurkha soldiers went on to serve in the British Army in the 2 world wars, with 43,000 losing their lives. Over the past 50 years they have served in Malaysia and Borneo, from 1948 to 1967, Cyprus, the Falklands, Kosovo and Hong Kong. More recently, Gurkhas have football fans could net themselves £50,000 if they spot a tiny engraving of England hero Harry Kane drawn on a special batch of £5 notes. Micro-engraver Graham Short, 72, has spent hundreds of hours etching the 5mm portrait on 11 fibers he plans to put into circulation if England reach the World Cup final. Mr. Short, of Bourneville, Birmingham, said, I have watched all of England's games during the World Cup and wanted to show my support in the only way I can. Scroll down for video. Each engraving has been done with a powerful medical microscope, extra fine needles, and has taken 6 days, working round the clock, to complete his Kane notes. He works from midnight to 5 a.m. to avoid distractions of noise and vibrations from traffic, and slows his heartbeat down to 20 beats per minute, helped by swimming up to 6 miles a day. Last year he sparked a Willy Wonka-style hunt for an etching of Jane Austen on 4 fivers, to mark the 200th anniversary of her death, which were later valued at £50,000. Now he hopes his Harry Kane specials will get the nation talking, as he plans to drop off 11 different notes around the country. He said, "I don't know of a better way to celebrate than getting the notes out into circulation for lucky shoppers to find. If England beat Croatia, I'll be zigzagging across the country, starting in Plymouth and maybe going through Oxford, the Midlands and Norwich, so people should check what fivers they've got. If someone comes across one of them, they could put them up for auction. I don't know how much it would go for, but all my work is insured for £50,000. He said, "If England lose to Croatia, then I suppose I'll just keep them, but I definitely will if they get to the final. I suppose there is a really good chance they would win. I suppose it's an obsession I have. I've engraved the Queen's head on a blob of gold and the Last Supper, but I'm really proud of my portrait of Harry Kane. I think he's a brilliant captain, very calm and professional, and keeps calm under pressure. I have to show the same calmness to achieve a good likeness on the money. It is illegal to deface any banknote under the Currency and Banknotes Act 1928. But the authorities appear unlikely to prosecute Mr. Short. Contrary to popular wisdom, it is not illegal to destroy a note." Mr. Short added, "Ideally it is not something you should do, drawing on banknotes. When I was doing the Jane Austen notes, I contacted the Bank of England and told them what I was doing. They said according to a 1928 Act of Parliament you cannot deface a banknote. But I thought to myself later, if the fine is not too high, I might still do it anyway. When I rang them again, they agreed not." This is a lovely moment. A little girl helped her disabled friend operate a new electric wheelchair. Young Abby whispered some words of encouragement in her friend's ear before taking her hand and placing it on the handlebar. She then took a step back and watched Rosie buzz around in her new chair with a beaming smile. Parents can be heard cheering while they film Rosie driving in and out of cones on what seems to be an obstacle course. But when the child's chair comes to a halt, her motivational friend comes to her side again and begins talking into her ear, presumably giving her more words of encouragement. The pair can be seen giggling and staring into each other's eyes as they chat to one another. In the middle of their conversation, Abby skips round to Rosie's other side to continue their chat before muttering a few more inspiring words. After their chat, Rosie speeds off on her chair again. One of the illusions of the Brexit debate is the idea that staying in the European Union is a way of protecting liberal values. In the story some Remainers like to tell, the EU is an institution that leaves behind the narrow loyalties and prejudices of nationalism to build a Europe-wide form of government. The referendum decision to draw back from this enlightened future could only be a retrograde step. In voting to leave, a British majority showed that it was stuck in the past. For Remainers, however, to opt for Brexit was unthinkable, and once they had recovered from the shock of realizing that the unthinkable had happened, they determined to do all they could to reverse the decision. Britain represented the illiberal past and the EU a liberal future. This was a far-fetched view at the time of the referendum, and today it is plainly false. Illiberal forces are advancing across the European continent. Hard-right governments have strengthened their hold on power in Poland and Hungary, while in Austria and Italy, Parties with links to interwar fascism play a pivotal role in ruling coalitions. The Czech Republic, Slovakia and Slovenia all have powerful far-right parties in, or close to entering, government. Sweden, Finland and Denmark are in the same position. But it is in Germany that the advance of the far right is most striking. Only a few months ago, Remainers were pointing to the solidity of Angela Merkel's Germany as evidence of the folly of Brexit. Led by this liberal icon, who had welcomed more than 1 million migrants into the country, the most powerful European state seemed to be the embodiment of a continent no longer shaped by national identities and borders. That picture of the future has been consigned to the past. Merkel lingers on, but she is a spent force. Under electoral threat from the far-right Alternative for Germany (AfD) party, she has decided to institute border controls to prevent any further influx of migrants. Whether these controls will be effective is unclear, but similar or more severe restrictions are likely to be imposed by other European countries. Austria, Italy, Hungary and Poland will act to block any inflows of migrants across their borders. The Schengen Agreement on Freedom of Movement, which the European Commission sees as one of the cornerstones of the EU and treats as a red line in Brexit negotiations, is collapsing. Merkel's decision to set up border controls is also unlikely to stem the advance of the far right in Germany. Before the election last year, the then German Vice-Chancellor and Foreign Minister Sigmar Gabriel told Der Spiegel that if the AfD entered the Bundestag, Nazis would speak in the German parliament for the first time in 70 years. When the AfD did just that, all other German parties vowed to refuse to work with them. But Merkel has survived only because these parties fear the further advance of the AfD that would almost certainly follow if she stepped down and triggered another election. It seems to me a safe bet that some years from now Germany will follow Italy and admit the far right into government. Leavers are routinely abused for being unrealistic, and there may be some who have had an oversimple view of Britain's post-Brexit place in an unstable world. But to my mind, doctrinaire Remainers are far more unrealistic about the stability of the EU. Soon after the referendum, I argued that Brexit was only the first in a succession of electoral revolts that would break out across the continent. Because parties of the center identified so closely with the European project, the danger was these revolts would be led by the far right. This is happening. Yet few Remainers seem to have noticed. Some may point to the French President Emmanuel Macron as proof of a counter-trend. But Macron's fate is uncertain. It should not be forgotten that over a third of those who voted in the final round of the presidential elections last year opted for Marine Le Pen, despite the National Rally Party leader reverting to her father's racist rhetoric. If Macron's unpopular economic policies fail to produce positive results for voters soon, it will be the far right and maybe the far left, which is equally hostile to the EU, that will benefit. Remainers respond to the advance of the far right by demanding more Europe, a more determined move to a transnational European state. They reject the suggestion, I would say fact, that it is this very project that has fueled the advance of anti-liberal forces across the continent. By attempting to remove immigration from the jurisdiction of national governments, the EU has left many people with the sense they have no control over their lives. The result of pushing for a transnational government that most Europeans do not want has been the rise of the worst kinds of nationalism. That is why borders are reappearing throughout the EU. Of course, bien-pensant Remainers will say this is an expression of popular racism. But if you call anyone who demands democratic control of immigration a racist, do not be surprised if many of them elect real racists. One of Italy's new leaders is calling for a register of Roma people. Europe has heard this sort of thing before. For its most devoted disciples, there is nothing wrong with the European project. It simply has not yet been applied in a pure manner. But isn't this what every blinkered ideologue says about their fantasy of a new world? There are still people who will tell you that the former Soviet Union began to practice large-scale repression only under Stalin, who distorted Lenin's original vision. Historical facts show this is not so. Mass arrests, systematic killing, and the Gulag all began under Lenin. The indifference to facts of totalitarian ideologies is well known. What is new is a type of liberalism that has also immunized itself against facts. Liberals like to think they are empiricists, in other words, they learn from experience. But ideological Remainers have learned nothing from the march of the far right across the European continent. No fact will ever dislodge their conviction that Europe represents freedom and progress and Britain the reactionary past. No doubt Britain has many faults. A virulent new strain of anti-Semitism has emerged in politics, mostly on the far left. But we have nothing like the large far-right movements that exist in nearly every continental European country. Unlike some European states, Britain remains a liberal democracy. The upshot of Brexit is unclear. Some believe it may be derailed. I think this is unlikely. But if Brexit is overturned, it will be ironic. Under the banner of a march to a more liberal future, Britain will blunder back into a rerun of a dark European past. John Gray is Emeritus Professor of Europe. Irish Deputy PM Simon Coveney today insisted Britain can't afford to leave the EU with no deal. Mr. Coveney dismissed UK threats to walk away without an agreement as bravado, suggesting that Theresa May will have to make more concessions to Brussels. The combative stance comes as British and Irish ministers meet to try to break the deadlock, with less than 12 weeks until the deadline for getting an outline Brexit deal. Officials are digging in for an attritional battle over the summer after Mrs. May unveiled her Chequers proposals for future trade, which would see the UK obey a common rulebook with Brussels and collect some taxes on behalf of the bloc. But Mrs. May is also facing claims she is trying to scare people witless with chilling warnings about the consequences of no deal so she can push through her plan for a soft departure. Ministers last night confirmed that medicine was being stockpiled to ensure Britain has enough if there is a disorderly departure. Brexit Secretary Dominic Raab said that while the government was not stockpiling food itself, it was taking steps to ensure enough would be available. A slew of other, technical, papers about the consequences of no-deal Brexit are expected to be released over the summer. One ally of the PM told the BBC's Newsnight, "We want to scare people witless so people will eventually embrace the Theresa May plan." Mrs. May confirmed last night that she had taken personal charge of the negotiations, downgrading the role of Mr. Raab and handing more powers to her aide Ollie Robbins. Under the changes unveiled by the PM, Mr. Robbins' unit in the Cabinet Office will have overall responsibility for the preparation and conduct of the negotiations. Meanwhile, Mr. Raab's Brexit department will be in charge of domestic planning for implementing a deal and a no-deal scenario. Mrs. May said, "I will lead the negotiations with the European Union, with the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union deputizing on my behalf." Appearing before the cross-party Brexit committee, Mr. Raab was pressed on whether Mr. Robbins was really in charge. "There is no tension between us, I think that is clear," he said. More than £22 billion worth of processed food and drinks are imported into the UK every year, minus 97% of it from the EU. Challenged about reports of stockpiling food by MPs on the Brexit Select Committee, Mr. Raab said, "It would be wrong to describe it as the government doing stockpiling. What we will make sure, And of course the idea that we only get food imports into this country from one continent is not appropriate. But we will look at this issue in the round and make sure that there is adequate food supply. A spokesman for Mr. Rob's department said this meant giving advice to food producers rather than taking charge of stockpiling itself. These are some of the key features of the Chequers plan being pushed by the UK government. Speaking in the House of Lords, Brexit Minister Lord Callanan was dismissive of food stockpiling claims. "I am not aware of any plans for stockpiling food. It seems to me to be a fairly ridiculous scare story," he said. "There are many countries outside of the EU that manage to feed their citizens perfectly satisfactorily without the benefit of EU processes." Health Secretary Matt Hancock said officials were looking at ways to stockpile drugs, medical devices and supplies. He told the Health Select Committee that some hard-to-obtain medicines may have to be flown into the country after Brexit Day in March next year. Mr. Hancock said he was confident a deal could be reached, but it was responsible to prepare for a range of outcomes. This includes working up options with industry to stockpile medical supplies if a deal cannot be reached, he told the Health Select Committee. "We are seeking to avoid a no-deal Brexit. I am confident that it can be avoided," he said. "But any responsible government needs to prepare for a range of outcomes, including the unlikely scenario of a no-deal. Since I have arrived in the department, I've asked this work to accelerate and I've met with industry leaders to discuss it. We are working right across government to ensure that the health sector and the industry are prepared and that people's health will be." A jealous husband whose estranged wife accused him of using smart house technology to spy on her has been jailed for 11 months. Electronics expert Ross Cairns, of Aldrincham, Greater Manchester, logged into an alarm system in the former matrimonial home and allegedly listened into his wife's telephone conversations. Manchester's Minshall Street Crown Court heard the 35-year-old used an app on his iPhone to access the system, which was designed to control heating, lighting and security systems at their £700,000 house in Hale. The court heard the couple had been married for 16 years and had 2 daughters now aged 5 and 3, but Cairns had started acting strangely after they split. His wife believed he had been logging into an iPad mounted on the kitchen wall. On one occasion, shortly after Mrs. Cairns told her mother she no longer loved her husband, the father of 2 suddenly turned up unannounced on the doorstep and repeated the conversation she just had, adding, "Oh, you don't love me anymore." The court heard. Cairns was convicted of offenses of stalking and harassment following incidents in which he made a throat-slitting gesture towards Mrs. Cairns and spat at her car. But the stalking conviction was later quashed after an appeal court judge said it could not be proved to a criminal standard and that the evidence was compromised due to the number of devices discussed. The harassment offenses were upheld and Cairns was jailed for 11 months after it emerged he was in breach of a suspended sentence imposed last year for fraud and theft. Mrs. Cairns, a 33-year-old accountant, told the appeal hearing had seen messages from another man and phoned him making threats. She added, "I spoke with my mom and told her that I didn't love Ross anymore. After that conversation I got a text message from Ross saying something about me wanting to get one over on him. He then came over straight away. I sent my mom a text message asking her to come back. He walked in and said, 'Kids, I'm moving back in.' He was being erratic. My mom came over and took the kids upstairs. He said he was moving back in with us and I said he couldn't do that. I rang his mom and then rang the police as he was being quite threatening and I felt threatened. He was being erratic. The police asked him to leave and he did leave. He sent messages the next morning apologizing, but he had previously been repeating the conversation I had with my mum back to me about me not loving him anymore. I asked him how he overheard the conversation with my mum. He said he overheard it on the laptop through the camera. I didn't know he had done it, but he was suspicious of me not being truthful. Mrs. Cairns also claimed her ex hacked into her Bumble dating agency account and changed her profile picture to one of her bottom in red knickers. His actions led to her contacting police. Cairns denied wrongdoing, claiming he accessed the system to change the lights. Jeremy Corbyn has been condemned by his closest political ally over his handling of the anti-Semitism scandal embroiling Labour, it was claimed last night. Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell is said to have demanded a climb down over a damaging stance which has seen the Labour leader branded an existential threat to the UK's Jewish community. Amid mounting signs of a shadow cabinet revolt, Mr. McDonnell is said to be particularly unhappy about disciplinary proceedings against Dame Margaret Hodge. Actions is being taken after the former Labour cabinet minister, a Jewish MP who lost family members in the Holocaust, accused Mr. Corbyn to his face of being a racist anti-Semite. Mr. Corbyn, who in the past has described the Hamas terror group as friends, has said he was upset by Dame Margaret's words. According to The Times, a senior shadow cabinet source said, "We are not comfortable at all with the way Jeremy has handled this, and don't know why we have got ourselves in this mess." Strong words have been said to him by people to Jeremy. Conversations have been held at the highest level. Asked if Mr. McDonnell had demanded a climb down, the source said, yes. Criticism has focused recently on Labour's failure to adopt the internationally accepted definition of anti-Semitism in its new code of conduct. The decision, which has angered moderate MPs, Jewish leaders and the chief rabbi, has fueled concerns that the watered-down version means activists could avoid being punished for making slurs such as comparing the actions of Israel to those of the Nazis. 3 Jewish newspapers last week said they had teamed up for an unprecedented joint front-page editorial because of the existential threat to Jewish. A Labour MP has been charged with 1 count of perverting the course of justice. It emerged today. Peterborough MP Fiona Onizanya, 34, appeared at Westminster Magistrates Court on July 12. The MP, an ally of Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, is due to appear in court again on August 13 in connection with the alleged offence. Ms. Onizanya is a member of Mr. Corbyn's frontbench team, serving as a whip. Cambridgeshire police have confirmed the alleged offence took place in its area. A spokeswoman said, Fiona Olayanka Onizanya, 34, from Peterborough has been charged with 1 count of perverting the course of justice. She appeared at Westminster Magistrates Court on the 12th of July and is due to appear in court again on the 13th of August. Ms. Onizanya's office declined to comment today when contacted by Mail Online. The MP holds one of Labour's most marginal seats after beating Tory Stuart Jackson by just 607 votes at the election. The Olympian, who sprayed 8 litres of pig's blood all over the £1 million London home of a Tory peer nicknamed Lord Legover after she caught him with another woman, is homeless and has been living in a caravan after her brother killed himself last week, it was revealed today. Lizzie Purbrick, 63, drew a gory 3-foot penis on the floor of the Kennington home she had shared with Lord Pryor of Brampton, and daubed Lady SL*2 and Big D*K Lord on his walls. In May, the former 3-day eventing champion caught her partner of 2 years with another woman, having moved back to Britain for the first time since the 1990s to be with him. A friend told The Times she was then cast aside, so decided to spray the home with liter upon liter of pig's blood, adding, she was in her 60s, effectively homeless and quite penniless. She then moved in with her former Army officer brother Chris Boone before her court case yesterday, but he became terminally ill and shot himself dead on July 6 at the B&B he ran near Kings Lynn, the hearing was told yesterday. Mrs. Purbrick claims she is now living in a caravan in Wells next the sea, while Lord Pryor is said to be living in nearby Burnham Overy after moving out of his family's 1700 stately home Swanington Manor, which is on the market for £3 million. She admitted causing criminal damage at the 63-year-old Piers South London flat at Camberwell Green Magistrates Court yesterday, and was handed 120 of community service and a restraining order to stay away from her victim. Today Mrs. Purbrick is flying to South Africa today to visit her estranged husband Colonel Reginald Purbrick and their 2 sons after a failed attempt to visit the house she covered in blood. Colonel Purbrick said, "She may be what she calls estranged, but she is the mother of my children. I'm sorry she got herself into the S***T. I hope she gets out of it." He married his wife Caroline on Valentine's Day 31 years ago and have 2 children, but they are believed to be separated. Scorned Lizzie Purbrick, 63, drew a 3-foot penis in blood on the floor of the home she had shared with Lord Pryor of Brampton, and daubed Lady SL**2 and Big D**K Lord on his walls. Camberwell magistrates had heard Purbrick wreck Mr. Pryor's apartment, tore clothes from cupboards and stuck ripped fabric to the wall in the shape of a cross which appear a part of her vandalization, before using several pints of blood and a garden sprayer to douse the room in red. Purbrick, who was part of the equestrian team for the 1980 Moscow Olympics, then left a check for £1,000 to Mr. Pryor labeled payment for the bull. Pryor is said to have billed her £15,000 for damages, which she has not paid. Describing her state of mind, her probation officer told the court, "She cried all the next day. Having a friend who was a butcher, she took 8 liters of pig's blood because Lord Pryor has interests in raising pigs." Yesterday she launched an extraordinary defense of herself on the steps of court and thanked the lovely judge for not jailing her after she was cleared of burglary. Ms. Purbrick started her 2-year relationship with Lord Pryor, who has been nicknamed Lord Legover, after meeting him at a dinner party in Norfolk. Purbrick described her life and said, "Everything starts in Norfolk. It is a hotbed of sex. I am a very, very well-bred toff. I was born and bred in Norfolk. So many people have said I should write my life story, but I am so bonkers I can't remember it." Asked who her love rival was, she told reporters she said, "Her husband is the most delicious man on the planet, and he has been woefully wronged." The damage was only discovered when alarmed neighbors spotted the blood seeping under the front door to the flat into the street. The court heard she had been in a relationship with former MP and Tory peer Lord Pryor for around 2 years, having met at a dinner party at Swanington Manor, Pryor's stately home, and both were estranged from their partners. Prosecutor Alex Dusautoy said, "The background of this offense is that Miss Purbrick is a former partner of the complainant David Pryor." On Wednesday the 9th of May this year around 5:30 p.m. Miss Purbrick attended Mr. Pryor's apartment using a key she still had from the relationship. She had on her several pints of pig's blood that she had bought from a butcher and a garden sprayer. She used the blood to write on the walls and on the floor words and phrases, "Whore, Lady SL**2, Big D**K Lord, and wet between the legs." She also drew a penis on the floor with blood. She also sprayed some blood on a suitcase and some bed linen. She left a check for £1,000 to Mr. Pryor labeled payment for the bull. She then dropped the remainder of the blood on the floor. The prosecutor said neighbors were alarmed when they saw red liquid spilling out from the front door out into the street and called the police. Mr. Du Sautoy said. One of Mr. Pryor's neighbors called the police, and at 11 p.m. Mr. Pryor returned to his apartment to see the blood in the apartment and on the floor. One of the neighbors saw someone enter the flat who they believed to be a male, and loud music was playing, and at 7:30 p.m. noticed a red liquid that came from under the door onto the pavement. Police were called at 10:36 p.m. Simon Nichols, defending, said the incident was out of character for his client, who was left reeling when her 2-year-long relationship with Lord Pryor came to an end. He said, "It finally comes to an end, to put this delicately, when she discovers him in the arms of another woman who is married to another member of the House of Lords." Mr. Nichols also said Purbrick's brother had been diagnosed with terminal cancer at the time and had sadly ended his own life just 3 days ago. "She is now living in a caravan," he explained. He continued, "The fact that at 63 she was an absolutely impeccable character with no antecedent history whatsoever. She goes to a police station and at the first opportunity admits immediately to police the damage that she had done. She has identified the relationship is over. The whole incident with the damage to the flat, she describes it in a way that was cathartic, and she has moved on. She is someone who had been emotionally vulnerable at a time when both the breakup of a relationship which she thought had longevity and the unfortunate problem with her brother dying, she acted in the way she did." Purbrick, of Westaker, Kingsley, admitted 1 count of criminal damage. She was ordered to complete 120 hours unpaid work and banned from contacting the Tory peer. District Judge Susan Green said, Lord Pryor came home to police in attendance at his flat. A neighbor was unsure if the red liquid was blood or juice, and police rightly forced entry, fearful of what they might find. What they did find was a very large amount of blood over the floors and walls in various locations. There were a series of highly abusive slogans on the wall and floor that were clearly derogatory to Lord Pryor and his new partner. They were, in my view, quite appalling. Kim Jong-un appears to be keen on turning his hard man image around after he was seen posing with sweets and pink satchels, not soldiers and missiles. The North Korean dictator, who recently backtracked on his nuclear threats, striking a deal with U.S. President Donald Trump, was pictured in a factory in his home nation. Over the last year he has ordered missile tests and fired fierce warnings about blasting warheads into mainland America and the island of Hawaii. Images emerging from the capital Pyongyang last year were of the hermit leader with military men, or parading around with weaponry. Now, he appears to be going for a softer image. Kim was pictured inspecting pink bags and sweets in factories, apparently pleased with what he saw. And his wife made a rare appearance. North Korea's First Lady, Rhode Island Solju, has made regular appearances at her husband's side in recent months as relations have warmed between North and South Korea. It is not clear. It's been the longest heat wave for Britain since 1976, and the driest start to summer since modern records began. And these photographs sent in by Mail Online readers show just how dry the grass around the country has become, as some areas have faced no rain in 50 days. Readers have sent in pictures of a rugby club training on parched ground in Lincoln, brown landscapes in East Sussex, and a scorched cemetery in London. Other images include a butterfly landing on dry grass in Lincolnshire, the parched Sandringham estate in Norfolk, and fields on the Isle of Wight in need of water. Temperatures could hit 95 F 35 C today and rise to 99 F 37 C tomorrow, triggering Met Office thunderstorm warnings for the next 2 days in parts of England. Today could be the hottest ever July day, beating the 98.1 F36.7C record set in 2015. And Britain could even break its all-time record of 101.3 F38.5C from 2003. Have you taken any photographs? Fears grew this morning for a 14-year-old boy who went missing while swimming in the sea with a friend on Britain's hottest day of the year so far yesterday. Scuba divers searched for Ben Quatermain off Clacton Pier in Essex today, in one of 3 separate incidents of people getting into trouble in the water yesterday. Divers last night recovered the body of a man in his 20s from Jubilee River in Slough, Berkshire, after he entered the water from a weir wearing just his denim shorts. And in the 3rd incident, fears were growing in Warwickshire for a 17-year-old boy who went missing yesterday while swimming at a popular beauty spot. The search for Ben, who was last seen in the sea near Clacton Pier, continued today as it emerged that pier workers helped rescue a second boy from the water. Essex police were called amid concerns for the welfare of the 2 teenagers in the water yesterday, and officers were on the scene just after 6:35 p.m. 2 pier workers helped keep one of the boys above water until an Inverleigh lifeboat crew could reach him, but the second teenager is still unaccounted for. Searches continued until darkness last night and were resumed by the Coast Guard early today, with police seen walking along the shoreline and a helicopter overhead. A member of the public raised the alarm after spotting the boys in the water, and pier worker Stuart Duff issued an emergency call, with 2 other staff members rushing to help with a lifebelt. Przemek Jakilla, 40, who works in the pier's amusement arcade, said he threw a lifebelt to one youngster but was unable to reach him due to the wind and currents. He threw the belt a number of times before the teenager was able to grab hold of it, and Mr. Jakilla kept a firm grip on the rope, along with pier bar worker Amy Bayliss, until an Inverleigh crew managed to pull the boy from the water and take him ashore. He tried to rescue the other boy but was unable to. As I got there, I just saw his head go under and he disappeared and did not come back up again, said Mr. Jakilla. There was just nothing we could do for him. He said the teenager he helped to save was still being dragged under by the currents when he had hold of the lifebelt. After the rescue, Mr. Jakilla continued his shift on the pier before leaving at 9 p.m. I was just doing my job and what we have been trained to do if anything like this happens, he said. Other members of staff, including Amy, also came along to assist, and luckily the lifeboat was able to get to the lad, pull him into their boat and bring him ashore. Nigel Brown, Clacton Pier's communications manager, said, "The lifebelts are relatively heavy and it was difficult conditions, but Przemek persisted with throwing the belt, around 10 to 12 times, until he managed to get it to the lad. We cannot say what might have happened had he not got the belt to him, but there would definitely have been less time to the lifeboat to get to him. He was pretty exhausted already, struggling to stay above the water and waving his arms. Przemek is a very reluctant hero, but a hero nonetheless, and he helped to save the youngster's life." Amy also played a significant role helping to hang on to the rope. Managing Director Billy Ball said the pier had recently put in new lifebelts, which are each in an enclosed plastic case to stop them from being vandalized. His sister Soph, 20, said on Facebook, "I truly beg that if anyone has any information regarding Ben Quatermain, please, no matter how small, contact someone." She later added last night, "I wish I could thank you all individually, but I'm drained. All I have to say right now is the emergency services have done the best that they can. The search has been called off until the morning. Thank you all so much, and if there are any updates I will let you know." And this morning, she told friends, search continues this morning. Scuba team will be out searching at low tide. Everyone thanks you for your support. Witness Ben Hughes Day said, "We watched helplessly as members of the Rhynley Coast Guard and others searched for two young lads reported missing at sea. A helicopter flying overhead, two boats and several courageous and heroic individuals who were on foot, neck-deep in water searching the seabed. The absolutely heartache that the families must be going through right now is also unimaginable." A statement from Rhynley Clacton Lifeboat said, "Yesterday evening at 5:39 p.m. Clacton's Atlantic-class lifeboat was launched to a yacht aground near the entrance to the Rivercan. While further crew members were awaiting their return, the pager sounded again, this time to a person in the water at Clacton Pier. Due to crew being on station, Clacton's D-class was launched within 2 minutes with 2 crew members aboard. As the heatwave began at the end of last month, there were 7 deaths related to the heat in just a week. One man died after being pulled from the River Derwent in Derbyshire, while the body of another was taken out of Crown Lakes near Peterborough. There were also deaths at Odenshaw Reservoir in Greater Manchester, while the body of Ryan Evans, 13, was recovered from a Stoke-on-Trent lake. The body of a 17-year-old boy was also recovered from the River Aire in Leeds. A man died in a lake in Nutfield, Surrey, and a woman drowned while swimming in the sea off Eastbourne. On arrival on scene, there was a male holding onto a life ring that had been thrown down from the pier. Shouts from the pier indicated there was another male in the water. The D-class made a rapid search of the area indicated, but there were concerns the male that was holding onto the ring was losing their grip. The crew pulled them aboard a lifeboat and landed them on the beach to an awaiting ambulance before returning to the search. The Atlantic lifeboat was called back, leaving 1 crew member aboard the grounded vessel to await Mersey's lifeboat to complete the recovery. All available shore crew were also requested to help with the search around and under the pier alongside the Coast Guard mobile units and those of the ambulance service. UK Coast Guard's rescue helicopter also joined in the search. The crews were stood down at 11 p.m. to restart the search again at 5 a.m. this morning, making best use of a low tide. Both lifeboats searched alongside shore crew and the Coast Guard mobile unit until 8 a.m. The search for the missing male continues. In Slough, Thames Valley Police were called at about 7:30 p.m. after the man vanished underwater after swimming with friends, and divers found a body. His death in the man-made river, which is designed to relieve pressure on the River Thames at times of flooding, was not being treated as suspicious. It comes 3 weeks after rescue divers from the same team found the body of 17-year-old Diarne Daly 3 weeks ago in the same stretch of river. Inspector Michelle Neal said, "I would like to remind everyone not to swim in the river. There is a weir in this part and the currents are extremely dangerous. As tempting as it may be in the warmer weather, rivers contain hazards below the water's surface which sometimes cannot be seen." Britain experienced its hottest day of the year so far yesterday with 95.2 F, 35.1 C temperatures, as railways, roads and the NHS struggled to cope. The Met Office said there is a 70% chance the UK's highest record temperature for July -98.1 F, 36.7 C, set in 2015 could be broken today. Motorists have been warned ahead of lightning, flash flooding and large hailstones that could hit eastern parts on this afternoon, with a thunderstorm warning in place for the afternoon until just before midnight. Temperatures are forecast to be in the 90 Fs, mid-30 Cs, for much of East and Southeast England, reaching 99 F, 37 C in London, and could rise higher still if there is a lot of sunshine. Meanwhile, in Warwickshire, the 17-year-old boy is believed to have got into difficulty while swimming in Bishop's Bowl Lakes, near Bishop's Itchington at 6:30 p.m. The teenager rescue teams, including police, an air ambulance and firefighters, scrambled to the scene and were seen scouring the 90-acre former lime quarry. The roads leading into the village were closed as rescue teams battled to find the missing boy. His parents were believed to be at the lake. One local resident said, "It really looks bad." There was a load of police and ambulance activity at around 7 p.m. Since then, the Manchester suicide bomber was rescued by the Navy from war-torn Libya 3 years before his pop concert atrocity, the Mail reveals today. HMS Enterprise plucked Salman Abedi, then 19, from the Libyan coast and took him to Malta for a flight home to Britain in August 2014. Last May he set off a bomb in Manchester Arena that killed 22, including 7 children. Abedi's younger brother, Hashem, who was in jail in Tripoli facing trial over the attack, was also rescued by HMS Enterprise. The pair had been caught up in fighting in Libya and were among more than 100 British citizens taken to safety. Photographs released by Ministry of Defence officials at the time showed the group being brought on board the Navy vessel. A Whitehall source said, "For this man to have committed such an atrocity on UK soil after we rescued him from Libya was an act of utter betrayal." The revelation will enrage families who lost loved ones in Abedi's despicable attack. It is also likely to raise fresh fears over possible intelligence failures. Abedi was known to the security services and was being monitored at the time of his trip to Libya. However, just 1 month prior to his rescue, MI5 closed his case as a result of mistaken identity. The presence of the Abedi brothers among the 110 evacuees from Libya in 2014 was confirmed by family friends in Libya. One said, "They were sent together by the Royal Navy to Malta." Sources in London also confirmed Salman was on HMS Enterprise. After being dropped off in Malta, Salman and his 21-year-old brother, the British-born sons of Libyan migrants, flew back to Manchester where they were living at the time. Salman, who was on a gap year from Manchester College, went on to study business management at Salford University, before dropping out and descending into a fanatical spiral that culminated in last year's suicide bombing at the age of 22. The Abedi brothers shuttled back and forth between Manchester and Tripoli because their parents, Ramadan and Samia, had returned to Libya. Ramadan is thought to have gone back in time for the 2011 revolution, allegedly fighting against the Gaddafi regime with the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. It is not certain whether the two brothers were with their father at the time of the revolution or instead in neighboring Tunisia. But they were on holiday in Libya in August 2014 when civil war fighting broke out and British officials offered to evacuate UK citizens. The Royal Navy was tasked with picking them up, along with other British nationals, on a list provided to sailors. By that time, the Foreign Office had already changed its official travel advice to warn Britons in Libya to leave immediately by commercial means because of the fighting around Tripoli and the wider instability nationwide. The advice said those unable to leave independently could seek assisted departure. Senior security sources stressed they did not believe Abedi had been radicalized at the time of the Royal Navy rescue. He later became brainwashed after watching bomb-making videos on Google-owned YouTube and terror material on other internet sites, they believe. A senior source told the Mail, "He was a British citizen, so it was our job to safeguard him. Salman was one of many people in that mix and we absolutely had to evacuate him. He was not a threat at the time and it was in a very different context." Other sources have claimed Abedi was on the front line and was hospitalized fighting alongside jihadists in Aidabaya, eastern Libya. However, a family friend was adamant that Abedi was there for innocent purposes. The friend said, Salman and Hashem were not involved in fighting at all, and they had spent a lot of time with their mother in Tunisia. At the time of the rescue, there were increasingly brutal battles between various militia groups fighting for control of Tripoli's airport, and dozens were killed. As a result, the Foreign Office announced it was temporarily closing its embassy and other consular operations in Libya. Amid fierce fighting, UK citizens were taken in small boats from the port of Tripoli to HMS Enterprise, a survey ship on a routine deployment in the Mediterranean. They were joined by 2 Irish citizens and a German. It is not known if the flights home to the UK were paid for by the British government. A security source downplayed claims that Abedi was involved in fighting and said he could have just been visiting his family. When they leave the UK, it becomes a lot more challenging to keep track of them, especially when they have family links in other countries, said the insider. But his visits were not necessarily for nefarious purposes. He did things largely alone. The internet played a large role when it came to his terror training. A report into the handling of the Manchester bombing by David Anderson QC revealed that Abedi was first actively investigated in January 2014, 7 months before the rescue. Published in December last year, the report said he was investigated because it was thought that he might have been an individual who had been seen acting suspiciously with a subject of interest to counter-terrorism police. Abedi did know the suspect, but turned out not to have been the individual seen with him, and his record was closed in July 2014. He was classed as a low residual risk. He came to the attention of the authorities again in October 2015 because of his supposed contact with an Islamic State figure in Libya. The report found that this allegation was wrong, and his file was closed once more. Abedi attended Burnage Academy for Boys in Manchester between 2009 and 2011 before going to Manchester College until 2013. 2 people who knew him from his college days claimed they called an anti-terrorism hotline to warn police about his extremist views. A community support worker, who did not wish to be named, told the BBC they had informed the authorities after Abedi publicly said he was supporting terrorism and that being a suicide bomber is ok. Greater Manchester police found no record of the phone calls, however. The Anderson Review concluded that the investigative actions taken in relation to Abedi, and the subsequent decision to shut his file, were sound on the basis of the information available at the time. At the time of the rescue in 2014, the MOD released a statement from HMS Enterprise's commanding officer, CDR Mark Varta, saying, "This is a period of uncertainty for UK citizens based in Libya, but we have been proud to play our part in enabling their move to safety." The then Defence Secretary, Sir Michael Fallon, said, "I thank the crew of HMS Enterprise for their support and professionalism in carrying out this important task." The 90-meter-long survey ship, normally based in Plymouth, had been 8 weeks into an 18-month mission carrying out surveys in the area. Last night, a government spokesman said, during the deteriorating security situation in Libya in 2014, Border Force officials were deployed to assist with the evacuation of British nationals and their dependents. Now put bomber's brother on trial, 2 brothers were saved by the Royal Navy from war zone. Today, one is dead after his devastating attack on Manchester. The other sits in a Libyan jail fighting to avoid justice. The Manchester bomber wasn't the only member of his family to be rescued by the Royal Navy on that day in August 2014. Salman Abedi's brother Hashem was also picked up by brave servicemen to return to Britain and play a key role in the atrocity carried out by Salman. Hashem, alleged to have helped to buy materials for the Manchester bomb, is back in Libya, languishing in prison in Tripoli under a militia guard as the Libyan and British governments wrangle over his extradition to the UK. He is being held by the Special Deterrence Force, also known as RADA, at a sprawling base at Mitiga Airport. Discussions on bringing him back to Britain are believed to have stalled. When the brothers were rescued by the Navy, it was 3 years after Colonel Gaddafi had been ousted and Libya was again in the grip of outright warfare. 2014 marked the start of a particularly bloody conflict known as the Second Civil War. Rival tribal groups fought bitterly for control of the country. Some were aligned with the Libyan government, elected democratically in June that year. Violently opposing was a hodgepodge of Islamist militias. Amid the turmoil, the UK embassy in Tripoli was closed and the Ministry of Defence scrambled to evacuate British citizens stranded in the war zone. But Salman was hardly some idle tourist caught up in the mayhem. Though born and bred in Britain, Abedi went on his school holidays to the war in Libya, where he may have learned to kill as a 16-year-old. While his Manchester classmates were embarking on A-levels, Abedi was taking up arms on a gap year at the front line. The teenager had been taken to Libya by his father Ramadan Abedi to fight in the revolution. Mr. Abedi SNR was rejoicing in the 2011 uprising against Gaddafi. He had been an active opponent of the Libyan tyrant in the early 1990s, and when he was forced to flee the regime, he was given political refuge in Manchester, where his second son Salman was born on New Year's Eve 1994. Friends said Salman Abedi grew up a typical teenager, supporting Manchester United and enjoying parties, drinking and smoking cannabis. He was teased with the nickname Dumbo at school for his big ears. But when the revolution against Gaddafi erupted, his father seized the chance to take him back to his homeland to join the battle against the despot. Mr. Abedi had long been a prominent member of the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group (LIF), a militant organization founded to pursue the violent overthrow of Gaddafi's dictatorship and establish an Islamist state. Many of its followers had waged jihad in Afghanistan against the Soviets, and in the late 1980s and early 1990s their aims overlapped significantly with British foreign policy. Britain had cut off diplomatic ties with Gaddafi's regime after Pan Am Flight 103 was blown up over Lockerbie and policewoman Yvonne Fletcher was murdered in London. It was even claimed, although denied, that MI6 encouraged a coup attempt in 1996 by the Islamist group. Either way, by the early 90s, many senior members of the LIF were being pursued by Gaddafi and given sanctuary by Britain, with many settling in Manchester. Among them was Mr. Abedi, a one-time employee of Libya's notorious secret police, who fled first to Saudi Arabia in 1991 and then to Britain a year later. Mr. Abedi and his wife Samia Debal, described as an incredibly bright nuclear engineer who graduated top of her class from Tripoli University, lived in the Wali Range district of Manchester on the same street as another LIF member, Abd al-Basit Azouz, an expert bomb maker. But life for the LIF veterans in Manchester started to get uncomfortable in 1999 when Tony Blair began the process of bringing Gaddafi in from the cold. Diplomatic relations were resumed and sanctions were lifted. But in Manchester, the old LIF warriors found their organization designated as a terror group by the UN and the Home Office. Many of the Libyans living in Britain were placed under control orders. Then came the Arab Spring in 2011, and Britain turned its back on Gaddafi once more. David Cameron's government sent warplanes to support the uprising against him. British Libyans queued up to return home to join the fight. Ramadan Abedi swiftly signed up to the cause. In the years that followed, Salman and Hashem divided their time between Manchester and the war in Libya, using their British passports to travel freely between the two. Their parents relocated to Tripoli, effectively leaving the boys to look after themselves in the UK. Salman quit Manchester College in 2013 with anger management issues after punching a girl for wearing a short skirt and telling the head teacher there were a lot of things going on with his family and fighting in Libya. Friends said he was slow and unintelligent, a heavy cannabis user, and increasingly violent to women. In 2014, he was back in Libya when full-blown war returned following the June parliamentary elections that squeezed the Islamist factions to a minority of seats. Rather than accept the result, Islamist leaders accused the new parliament of being dominated by supporters of the dictator and battled the nationalist militia. By August, Egypt and the United Arab Emirates were launching airstrikes against the Islamists, who had seized control of Tripoli airport. To make matters even more chaotic, fanatics from the Islamic State group were establishing a stronghold in coastal areas, broadcasting gruesome videos of their self-proclaimed warriors beheading captured Christians. It was around this time that the Royal Navy ship was dispatched to help Britons make their escape from the hellish situation. Salman and Hashem, who had been spending the summer in Tripoli with their family, took their chance to join the evacuation. Back in Manchester, Abedi enrolled at Salford University, collecting about £7,000 from the taxpayer-funded student loans company. He pocketed the money and dropped out. By now Salman, who was chanting in the streets and putting the bins out wearing Islamic robes, had become fully radicalized. He used the taxpayers' cash to help bankroll his terror plot, traveling to and from Libya where he became increasingly battle-hardened. Then on May 22 last year, he took his explosives-packed rucksack bearing a logo of the Union flag and wrought terrible carnage on the country that gave his parents safe haven and rescued him from a war zone. Hashem, 21, was arrested in a remote farmhouse outside the Libyan capital a day after the suicide bombing in May last year. The British government requested in October last year that he be extradited to face trial over the massacre. He is separately facing allegations that he was part of a plot to kill a British ambassador in Libya. Hashem is held as in a prison section specifically for his suspects, of which there are around 250. His father Ramadan was also detained outside his home in a Tripoli suburb but later released. British police believe Hashem helped his brother buy the materials to build the bomb detonated at Manchester Arena. He has also been linked to a suicide plot to kill Peter Millet, the UK's envoy to Libya. But in May this year senior Libyan sources told the Mail that Hashem could escape UK justice by refusing to face trial here. Killers vow thank you. A nail bomb he set off among happy families. Salman Abedi waited until he was surrounded by happy families before detonating his bomb. Metal nuts and bolts packed into his rucksack tore through his victims, many of them teenage girls. 7 of the 22 dead were children. Abedi, 22, blew himself up in the foyer of Manchester Arena at 10:31 p.m. last May 22. Just as tired but happy teenage fans were leaving after the performance by American singer Ariana Grande. His devastating bomb killed people standing up to 20 yards away. The youngest victim was an 8-year-old girl and the eldest a woman of 51. Dozens of survivors suffered life-changing injuries, including the loss of limbs. More than 21,000 fans had been at the sold-out concert. Many had received tickets as birthday and Christmas presents. Just as Miss Grande finished her encore, and the first fans were leaving for home, Abedi pressed his trigger. Among those killed were a brave aunt who shielded her 11-year-old niece from the nail bomb blast and parents who were waiting to collect their children. Safi Rose Roussos, 8, was killed after becoming separated from her mother and sister at the venue. Martin Head, 29, a Coronation Street superfan who was due to go on a 2-month trip of a lifetime to America, was also killed. Georgina Collender, who had met Miss Grand backstage at a previous concert, died in hospital with her mother by her side. The 18-year-old was described as the kind of girl who lit up the room. The cruel randomness of the blast determined who lived and who died. Off-duty police officer Elaine McIver, 43, was killed but her husband and children survived with injuries. Caroline Davis had just walked into the foyer with her best friend Wendy Fall when the bomb exploded. Wendy, who was 50, died instantly while Caroline suffered shrapnel wounds, a dislocated shoulder and was knocked unconscious. Photographs showed stunned survivors, including then 14-year-old Eve Sr., being taken to safety. She was seen with her jeans torn, a bandaged knee and blood streaks down her arm. Eve, who was just 5 yards from a Betty, suffered 18 shrapnel wounds, burns and a severed nerve in her leg. She has since spoken of her desire to go into nursing. "Before Manchester I had no idea what I wanted to be when I grow up," she said. But staying in hospital and seeing Theresa May is facing more trial by fire today after Labour Brexiteers saved her from disastrous defeat in the Commons. The Prime Minister will take the last PMQS before the summer recess after fighting off a potentially existential challenge to her negotiating strategy by just 6 votes last night. But there is little sign of the pressure easing, as Boris Johnson is preparing to unleash a devastating resignation statement in the House later. Mrs May must also run the gauntlet of a grilling by senior MPs on the liaison committee this afternoon, before a showdown with restive Tory backbenchers at a private meeting tonight. Amid dramatic scenes at Westminster last night, a dozen Conservative Remainers defied warnings they would collapse the government by siding with Jeremy Corbyn to demand Britain stays in the EU customs union. Mrs May has repeatedly insisted that the UK must not be in a customs union, as it would prevent trade deals being struck elsewhere. But rebels ignored warnings from Tory Chief Whip Julian Smith that defeat would prompt him to call a vote of confidence in Mrs May today, followed by a possible general election. Tory insiders said another 10 Eurosceptic MPs would have sent in letters of no confidence in Mrs May if she had lost last night's vote, potentially pushing the total over the 48 needed to spark a leadership challenge. Rebels inflicted an early defeat on the government when they voted to keep Britain tied into the European Medicines Agency after Brexit by 305 votes to 301. But, minutes later, the tables were reversed as MPs voted by 307 to 301 to reject an amendment to the trade bill ordering the PM to pursue a continuation of the customs union. 5 Labour MPs voted with the government, former ministers Frank Field and Kate Hoey and backbenchers John Mann, Graham Stringer and Kelvin Hopkins, who is currently sitting as an independent following suspension. If they had voted the other way, the government would have lost by 4 votes. The titanic battle sparked rancour with calls for the Tory and Labour rebels to be deselected from their Commons seats. The Conservative Chief Whip Mr Smith also had to offer a grovelling apology after failing to honour a deal to pair Lib Dem MP Jo Swinson, who is on maternity leave. Brexiteers David Davis, Brexit Secretary Boris Johnson, Foreign Secretary Steve Baker, Brexit Minister Scott Mann, Ministerial Aide Robert Courts, Ministerial Aide Connor Burns, Ministerial Aide Chris Green, Ministerial Aide Maria Caulfield, Tory Vice Chair Ben Bradley, Tory Vice Chair Remainers Gutto Bebb, Defence Minister Philip Lee, Justice Minister pairing is when a government supporter does not vote to offset the absence of an opposition MP who cannot come to the chamber. But Tory chairman Brandon Lewis voted anyway, leading to allegations of cheating. Tory rebel Anna Soubry said the whipping operation had been an appalling spectacle. These nonsenses of threatening general elections and votes of confidence in the Prime Minister, and as I actually said to the Deputy Chief Whip, bring it on, because I shall be the first in the queue to give my vote of full confidence in the Prime Minister, she said. Problem is, I don't think that she's in charge anymore. I've no doubt Jacob Rees-Mogg is running our country. Miss Soubry said they had been hollow and rather ridiculous threats. She also urged a government of national unity to deal with Brexit. She told BBC Radio 4's Today programme, "We simply cannot go on like this. People in this country are fed up to the back teeth with Brexit." Miss Soubry said Labour was in an even greater mess than the Conservatives, with the old Trotskyists in charge. "I personally would abandon the Labour frontbench and I would reach beyond it, and I would encompass Plaid Cymru, the SNP and other sensible, pragmatic people who believe in putting this country's interests first and foremost," she added. Money leaving without a deal would mean an immediate Brexit on March 29 after tearing up a 21-month transition agreement. This included giving £39 billion to the EU, which ministers would no longer have to pay, a House of Lords report claims. Goods trade. The Chequers Agreement effectively proposed keeping Britain in the single market for goods and agriculture to preserve frictionless trade and protect the economy. Customs checks on cross-channel freight would cause havoc at ports, hitting food supplies and other goods. Even Brexiteers admit to a big economic impact in the short term. Britain could waive customs checks on EU produce to free up backlogs, but would Brussels do the same? Tariffs. All EU-UK trade in goods is free of tariffs in the single market. Trade would revert to World Trade Organization rules. The EU would charge import tariffs averaging 2–3% on goods, but up to 60% for some agricultural produce, damaging UK exporters. We have a trade deficit with the EU of £71 billion. They sell us more than we sell them, so the EU overall would lose out. German cars and French agriculture would be worst hit, as would UK regions with large export industries. Tariffs could also mean price inflation. But UK trade with the EU is 13% of GDP and falling compared to non-EU trade, which generates a surplus and is likely to grow. The outlook would be boosted by Britain's ability to strike trade deals. Immigration. The UK would immediately have control over its borders and freedom to set migration policy on all EU migrants. UK nationals would likely lose their right to live and work in the EU. There would be legal uncertainty for the 1.3 million Britons living in the EU and the 3.7 million EU nationals here. City of London. Many firms have already made contingency plans for no deal, but there would probably be a significant degree of disruption and an economic hit. Ministers would be likely to take an axe to tax and regulations to preserve the UK's economic advantage. Aeroplanes. Fears of planes not being able to fly appear far-fetched, unless the EU is determined to destroy both business and tourism. Rules to keep planes in the air are likely to be agreed. The EU has many deals with non-EU countries as part of its open skies regime. European courts. Britain would be free from the edicts of the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg and all EU. Wimbledon's women were celebrated with bigger and better coverage by the BBC this year, just 3 years after the broadcaster was accused of bias in its tennis reports. A massive 78% of the tournament's highlight show was dedicated to the female players, while entire segments were devoted to Serena Williams. In 2018, There were 2 hours and 45 minutes of clips and commentary from women's games, and 38 minutes dedicated to men's matches on Today at Wimbledon, this weekend. The official reports were also accompanied by analysis, montages and sequences which celebrated the players of both sexes. Just 3 years ago the BBC was accused of major bias as 75% of coverage was dedicated to men's matches. The BBC Trust, the corporation's governing body, investigated the claims after the 2015 tournament. And, while complaints were not upheld, bosses admitted to finding a startling disparity. At the time it said, trustees were pleased to note the executives' assurances that they would take the complainants' research into consideration when planning coverage of Wimbledon 2016. This year saw a big change. During the highlight show, presented by Claire Balding, 72% of the content was solely about women. In the first week, the Women's Tennis Association told The Times it was proud to see its amazing athletes well represented and celebrated. It was Serena Williams who stole the show in the first week, with more than 50% of in-depth analysis being on her, the winner of 23 Grand Slam tournaments. There were 224 players, but on the fifth show, all of the commentary-based clips were on sisters Venus and Serena Williams. The overall winner did not feature until the second week. Angelique Kerber, the 11th seed, was shown on the show days after it began. Wimbledon has frequently been at the center of sexism calls. Players have previously made demands for more equality on court. And this year, in places, it seems changes were made. Andy Murray joined their ranks last year when on the second Monday, all 4 men's matches were scheduled for the main show courts, but only 2 of 4 women's matches. Novelist, campaigner and tennis fan Mark Leyland researched Wimbledon center court action from 1993 to 2017 and found an average 60-40th split in favor of men's matches shown on the main stage. He said, "They persist in blaming the imbalance on the complexities of a system which has long since achieved equality at the other Grand Slam tournaments, an argument which defies all logic. But it may be felt that their actions, in scheduling more men's than women's matches on their main show courts every year for more than a quarter of a century, speak louder than their words." Wimbledon's third day saw show courts filled with more women's matches than men's for the first time in 25 years. Millions tuned in again to watch the tournament this year. The BBC served 24.1 million stream requests during Wimbledon this year via BBC Sport and BBC iPlayer, making it the most streamed Wimbledon to date. The BBC said, "The highlights show brings together the best tennis of the day and all decisions are editorially led." Angelique Kerber beat 7-time champion Serena Williams to win her first Wimbledon title. For the men, Novak Djokovic earned his first Grand Slam title in more than 2 years by beating the mother of a jihadi who could face the death penalty, and the U.S. launched a legal bid yesterday to stop Britain handing over evidence that could be used to convict him. Alexander Cote, 34, and Shafi El-Sheikh, 30, members of his gang the Beatles, face extradition from Syria to the U.S. for trial. Britain has agreed to help the U.S. authorities without the usual assurance that they would not face the death penalty. The Home Office said last night it had paused its assistance following legal action by El-Sheikh's mother. A spokesman said, "We received a request from the legal representative of the family of one of the suspects to pause IMLA mutual legal assistance response. We have agreed to a short-term pause. The government remains committed to bringing these people to justice, and we are confident we have acted in full accordance of the law and within the government's long-standing law policy." The government has not formally opposed the pair being sent to Guantanamo Bay. Human rights lawyer Gareth Pearce, representing El-Sheikh's mother, has written to government lawyers saying she believes Sajid Javid's decision to be unlawful and calling for a judicial review. The Home Office must respond to Ms. Pearce's letter before she can apply for a judicial review. In a statement, she said, "The application raises questions of enormous constitutional importance, including the ability of a minister without reference to Parliament to agree to so complete a departure from a prohibition understood by all to have the status of constitutional certainty and without any public debate." Acts carried out by the jihadi Beatles gang include the murders of U.S. journalists James Foley and Stephen Sotloff, British aid workers David Haynes and Alan Henning, and American aid worker Peter Kassig. In 2014 and 2015, they held and tortured 20 hostages. The Beatles pair were captured in January. A mother who was desperately searching for her missing diabetic daughter has revealed the girl is back home in response to a concerned tweet from Daniela Westbrook. Sharon Glendinning frantically appealed for help in finding her 13-year-old daughter Morgan, who hadn't been seen since Monday, the first day of the school holidays. The EastEnders actress reached out to Sharon on Twitter on Tuesday asking if Morgan had been found yet, and the mother confirmed she was back home and safe. In the tweet, Danielle asked, "Have you found your daughter?" Sharon replied, "Yes, thank God she is now home and we giving her lots of hugs and busy sorting out her diabetes. Thank you X." Morgan's family feared the schoolgirl from Rushton in Northamptonshire traveled to London after meeting a person on Instagram. Morgan is diabetic and was believed to have gone missing without taking her medication with her. At the time when Morgan was missing, her distraught father Brian, 46, said, "We don't exactly know why she has gone missing." He continued, "She has been talking to different people on Instagram. She is very secretive about who she talks to. We think she might have met up with them on there." Sharon said when Morgan was still missing, "This is my daughter. She is believed to have traveled to London, possibly Ealing area. She is type 1." A motorist accused of killing an Olympic cycling champion's mother while she was riding her bike was on the phone to his wife seconds before the crash, a jury has been told. Liam and Victoria Rosny, both 32, deny perverting the course of justice by deleting records of the calls made seconds before Carol Boardman was hit by Mr. Rosny's pickup truck on July 16, 2016. Rosny, of Connah's Quay, North Wales, denies causing her death by dangerous driving, as well as an alternative count of causing death by careless driving. Today Mold Crown Court heard Mrs. Boardman, 75, whose cyclist son Chris won gold at the 1992 Olympics, had suffered multiple injuries when she was hit by Mr. Rosny's Mitsubishi after falling from her bike. John Philpotts, prosecuting, said Mrs. Boardman, a keen cyclist, had been hit by the vehicle on a mini roundabout at the junction of Mold Road and Fernley North in Connah's Quay and later died in hospital. Mr. Philpotts said, "It's the prosecution case that Liam Rosny had time to see Mrs. Boardman and to stop in time to avoid driving over her as he did, but he clearly did neither of those things." Mr. Philpotts told the court phone provider records showed 4 calls between Mr. Rosny and his wife in the run-up to the crash, with the last one terminated 4 seconds before the crash is calculated to have happened. But the calls did not appear on the log of his phone handset, which was recovered by police from Mrs. Rosny, who arrived at the scene after the crash. When Mrs. Rosny's phone was seized by police in November 2016, all calls from the date of the collision and before had been deleted from the call log. Mr. Philpotts said, "The prosecution say that this is a case which tragically illustrates the potential extreme danger of using a mobile telephone whilst driving. As I've told you more than once, Liam Rosny's speed leading up to the collision was perfectly reasonable. There's no suggestion, I repeat, that he was under the influence of drink or drugs. But he was so distracted by the use of his mobile telephone that he was driving dangerously at the time when Mrs. Boardman unfortunately became dismounted from her bicycle. He added, the prosecution say both of these defendants well know the significance of their telephone conversations in the time leading up to the point very shortly before the collision. They knew it and they deleted the relevant calls from their respective handsets. Kaylee Anders, who had witnessed the crash while driving, said Mr. Rosny did not seem to realize he had hit Mrs. Boardman at first. She said, he was looking left and then down, and then left and then down. I think he was on his phone. She told the court that when he realized what had happened, she heard him say she came from nowhere. The jury, of 7 men and 5 women, NATO leaders are preparing to sign a pledge to slash the amount of time it takes to move troops between allied countries to help counter the threat from Russia. The so-called mobility pledge aims to reduce the amount of time a commander must wait for permits to cross an allied country with tanks, troop and ammo from up to 40 days to just 5. Leaders of the 27-member alliance are expected to sign up to the pledge when they meet in Brussels from tomorrow to discuss security. Anke Belleveld, the Dutch defense minister who has led calls for the pledge, told The Times that signing an agreement would send a signal that NATO is serious about protecting its borders. But she is calling for allies to go even further, noting that Vladimir Putin can move his forces wherever he wants simply by giving the order. Mrs. Belleveld eventually wants to create a military Schengen area which tanks and troops could move through unhindered, just as people were supposed to be able to do through a borderless Europe. By contrast, NATO commanders must apply weeks in advance for a permit to cross allied nations by land. Jüri Luik, the Estonian defense minister, said obtaining permits is not a problem when it comes to training exercises as these are planned long in advance. However, the red tape would badly hinder NATO's ability to respond to a real-time crisis, such as an invasion of Europe by Russia. He said, one has to have certainty that your echelons of tanks won't be standing at the border of another ally just to get clearance. I hope we can sign the mobility pledge. This is very important in crisis time. Heads of government or state from the 27 NATO nations will meet in Brussels from Wednesday for a summit that is expected to be dominated by spending. President Trump has repeatedly bemoaned the fact that European nations are failing to meet spending commitments to the alliance, leaving America to pick up the tab. In recent weeks he has also slapped trade tariffs on EU and Canadian steel, citing national security concerns, causing friction between allies. Trump will also proceed from the summit straight to a meeting with Putin, as if to underline America's cooling relationship with NATO. That meeting will likely rankle British Prime Minister Theresa May, as the UK has accused Russia of repeatedly carrying out chemical weapons attacks on its soil. On Sunday, Don Sturgis died after being exposed in Novikov, the same Russian-made nerve agent used to poison the Skripals in Salisbury in March. Sturgis's partner, Charlie Rowley, remains in hospital after also being exposed. Russian double agent Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia spent weeks in hospital, most of them in a coma, after being poisoned with the same substance. Trump's meeting with Putin comes after he also called for Russia to be readmitted to the G7 after it was thrown out over the annexing of Crimea. That move, which came in 2014 after the Moscow-friendly government of Viktor Yanukovych was toppled, is a prime concern for NATO commanders and has seen allied nations. New Zealand's acting Prime Minister Winston Peters has called on neighbouring Australia to change its flag, saying it had pinched the Kiwi banner's design and was causing confusion. "We designed it and they borrowed it, and if we wanted to clear the matter up they should change their flag," Peters told reporters. "It must be patently obvious that all over the world people are confused. I've been in places like Turkey and elsewhere where they've confused our countries on the basis of those flags. It's not helpful." Both the New Zealand and Australian flags are dark blue with the Union flag emblem of founding nation the United Kingdom in the top left corner. The only major difference is that the Australian version has 6 white stars, 5 representing the Southern Cross, while New Zealand depicts the constellation with 4 red stars. Peters, who was temporarily leading the country while Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern is on maternity leave, feels strongly about the flag issue. The 73-year-old also raised it earlier this week, complaining we got there first with this design. Opposition leader Simon Bridges ridiculed Peters' flag preoccupation, accusing him of populism and labelling him a poor man's Donald Trump. Australia-New Zealand flag confusion. Bridges said New Zealanders he had spoken to were concerned about topics such as the economy and healthcare. "They never raised with me changing the Australian flag. That's weird by even his standards," he told Parliament. The comment comes after Mr. Peters, who was also the country's foreign minister, slammed Australia for deporting New Zealand nationals without trial. More than 1,000 New Zealanders have had their visas cancelled in Australia since stricter deportation laws were introduced 4 years ago. New Zealand adopted its flag in 1902, while Australia's was not officially recognised until 1954. However, the Australian version had been used informally since 1901, and both countries say similar designs were common throughout the late 1800s. New Zealand held a referendum on changing its flag to a silver fern design in 2016, with the proposal. A psychiatric patient who murdered a grandmother after escaping from a mental health center made 14 emergency calls to police on the day of the killing, a coroner said. Nicola Edgington, 36, stole a butcher's knife and stabbed 58-year-old Sally Hodkin to death on Bixley Heath, southeast London, in October 2011. Prior to the attack, Edgington, who had killed her own mother 6 years earlier, phoned 999 from a hospital, but her calls were downgraded in importance by the Metropolitan Police, a pre-inquest review hearing was told. Edgington, who has schizophrenia, was previously convicted of manslaughter and detained indefinitely under the Mental Health Act after killing her mother in 2005. She was released into the community just 3 years later. A pre-inquest review into Mrs. Hodkin's death heard how 2 police officers took Edgington to A&E after making calls to police on the 10th of October 2011. She made further calls from the hospital, but the importance of the calls were downgraded. She was later transferred to the Bracton Centre, run by the Oxleas NHS Foundation Trust in Dartford, Kent, which provides forensic mental health services. The hearing was told how Edgington was left alone in a room with a door on a latch. She is also understood to have been given access to the foyer. A nurse who manned its reception quit her job as a result of a police investigation into the killing. Edgington later walked out of the centre and travelled back to London, where she killed Mrs. Hodkin and attempted to murder Carrie Clark, then 22, who survived after fighting off her attacker. Edgington was jailed for life with a minimum term of 37 years in 2013. Reports by NHS England and Independent Police Complaints Commission have already been carried out, but a coroner ruled at a previous hearing that an investigation still needs to be conducted into the way Edgington was handled by police and medical staff on the day of the attacks. November 2005, Edgington killed her 60-year-old mother Marion in 2005, stabbing her 9 times in the face, neck and chest with a kitchen knife at her home in East Grinstead, West Sussex. October 2006, found guilty of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility and held under the Mental Health Act. September 2009, released from a secure psychiatric hospital. October 2011, attempts to stab Kerry Clark before murdering Sally Hodkin. March 2013, sentenced to life for murder today. Coroner Sarah Ormond Walsh said the scope of the inquest, which is due to be held in October, will include evidence of the calls made to police. She said she had found there had been about 14 calls made by Edgington to police from various geographical locations on the day of the attacks. She continued, one of them for assistance when she was in A&E and she preferred to speak to police. These were on the day, and my point was not necessarily suggesting there would be any legal argument, something would be amiss each time, but at least calling 999. Bryony Ballard, representing the Met Police, said the police watchdog report into the incident listed only 4 calls. She continued, I know there were some calls made after the officers had left her there at the hospital. At 4:52 a.m., 15 minutes after PC Phillips exits the hospital, and as a result of that PC Phillips is then recontacted and asked about how she was, and as a result of that the call is downgraded. Then there's another call, but I didn't see 14 calls. The coroner said she will also investigate the environment Edgington was left in at the unit after she was assessed by a mental health liaison nurse and duty doctor. She said, the environment Miss Edgington was left in because it was one where there a latch on the door that she was left in. There were 15-minute observations. Who was the person who made the decision about the 15-minute observations? Samantha Minchin, representing the Health Trust, said, the mental health liaison nurse and the duty doctor, and I understand the duty doctor no longer works for the trust. We can make inquiries. Almost 1 in 5 workers with diabetes have been disciplined by their bosses for taking time off work because of their condition, new research has revealed. In the survey of Britons living with diabetes, 19% claimed they had faced disciplinary action in the past for missing work as a result of the disease. Another 25% claimed they had been grilled about sick days they had taken, while 12% said they had been refused time off, despite employment laws banning the discrimination of people with the condition. Glucose monitoring firm Dexcom, which commissioned the report, is now calling for more to be done to educate companies about its responsibilities to employees living with diabetes. John Lister, general manager of Dexcom EMEA, said, our research shows that people with diabetes still feel discriminated against in their place of work, to the point that they feel unable to miss work for fear of missing out on promotions or even losing their jobs. Having to cope with the day-to-day struggle of diabetes is difficult enough, without the pressure that sufferers appear to be under as they try to continue to work and progress in their careers. We hope this research will prompt colleagues and bosses to re-examine how they view and treat people in their team who they know are living with diabetes. The survey questioned over 800 Britons living with diabetes, which now affects more than 4 million people in the UK. Of those in work, a quarter, 24.9%, said they had to take more than 3 days off work in the last year because of their condition. Most, 60.7%, claimed hospital appointments caused them to miss work, while 47% blamed exhaustion and 28% said they had taken time off after suffering a diabetic hypo. In the survey, only half, 50.5%, of respondents said they never worried about taking time off work due to their diabetes. and just over half, 51%, said they felt employment laws designed to protect people with diabetes from discrimination were properly enforced in their workplace. The Disability Discrimination Act states that employers should make reasonable adjustments to stop diabetics being disadvantaged at work in comparison with non-diabetic workers. These could include adjusting working times, changing a person's duties, allowing time off, or even transferring the employee to a more appropriate position. However, this new research by Dexcom highlights a third, 30.8%, of respondents said they were worried their diabetes would damage their careers. Another 30% said they were more embarrassed about taking a sick day for their diabetes than a common cold, with a staggering 16% citing they have pretended to have a cold when asking for a day off than saying it's due to their glucose levels. Michael Connolan, head of external affairs at the Type 1 diabetes charity JDRF, said, "Live with diabetes presents its challenges. Worrying about your job shouldn't be one of them. We welcome all efforts to help employers develop greater understanding of long-term conditions such as diabetes." Dexcom's next generation of wearable continuous glucose monitors, Dexcom G6, eliminates the need for finger prick testing and tracks a user's glucose levels 24 hours a day, providing real-time alerts through a sensor that is inserted just under the skin. The device wirelessly transmits glucose readings every 5 minutes to a smartphone, smartwatch, or medical device app, triggering an alarm when a patient's blood sugar soars too high or low. An artist who was accused of fraud in an attempt to block her neighbor's plans for an extension to their £20 million house has been cleared by a judge. Brenda Fenton, 87, was accused by Clive and Marcia Lewis of doctoring a property plan to claim a boundary wall separating their properties as hers. The forgery was said to be part of a single-minded quest to stymie the Lewises' plans in a feud which has gone on for 21 years. The neighbors live in Cavendish Avenue, a street in St. John's Wood which they share with former Beatle, Paul McCartney. The case was heard at Central London Country Court last month, and now, after taking time to consider his ruling, Judge Nicholas Parfitt has rejected the fraud claim against Mrs. Fenton. Although there was circumstantial evidence against her, Mrs. Fenton denied the allegation with an understandable degree of upset, he said. And there were others who could have added the so-called single quote T-mark, a symbol used to show who owns a boundary wall, he added. My finding is that I am not persuaded that Mrs. Fenton was responsible or party to the addition of the disputed T-mark to the plan, he ruled. During an earlier hearing, the court heard Mrs. Fenton had been friendly with her famous ex-Beatle neighbor, but the relationship with the Lewises was less cordial. The first disputes between them occurred in the late 1990s, and since then they have frequently been matched up in court battles. In 2005, Mrs. Fenton lost a case brought against her by her neighbors over her installation of fence panels on the shared garden wall. But she won the next battle in 2015 when a judge ordered the Lewises to remove a roof from which water had flowed from their extension onto her property. That case left the Lewises nursing over £250,000 in legal bills. Surveyor Mr. Lewis, 65, and his interior designer wife, also 65, have since taken down the roof, but now plan to build a 2-story extension instead. They claimed the enlarged structure would finally solve the rainwater problem. Last year, an independent surveyor issued a Party Wall Award, which authorizes them to raise the boundary wall to build their extension. But that only led the neighbors back to court, as Mrs. Fenton launched a challenge to the surveyor's decision. Her barrister, Stuart Frame, claimed that the Party Wall award should be overturned as the wall in question is not actually shared. But for the Louises, Philip Rainey QC said Mrs. Fenton should not be allowed to argue that the wall is not a jointly owned party wall. She had agreed informally through solicitors 21 years ago that the boundary runs down the middle of the wall, Mr. Rainey told the judge. She had also withdrawn an appeal against a previous party wall award and stood by in silence while the original extension was built off the wall, he claimed. Ruling, Judge Parfit said Mrs. Fenton would not be allowed to argue that the boundary between the properties does not run down the middle of the wall. The predominant factor is that she has acted in a manner which is only consistent with an objective representation that the boundary runs through the center of the lower part of the disputed wall, he said. He added, if it were necessary to describe the position from Mrs. Fenton's point of view, it would be a reluctant acceptance of a reality with which she continued to disagree. This is the first picture of a British groom-to-be whose stag do saw a homeless man paid £90 to have his name and address tattooed on his forehead. James Blake, 36, of North Shields, North Tyneside, is believed to be the stag on the lad's trip to Benidorm, where cash was allegedly handed to the Polish rough sleeper. The group are reported to have bumped into Tomek on a night out in the Spanish resort and escorted him to a tattoo parlor to have the inking. They ordered the man to get Jamie Blake, North Shields, and 28 single quote tattooed on his forehead, but he was unable to complete the tattoo due to the pain. Today there was no answer when Mail Online visited Mr. Blake's home in North Shields, and it is believed he is out of the country with his wife Carrie Clay, a dinner lady at a local school, and their 2 children. A neighbor said he had been on a trip to Benidorm or somewhere like that. His father Brian Blake, 77, from North Allerton, North Yorkshire, told